Chapter 412. Dr. Lin looked at her and said, I don't remember exactly which book mentioned it. You can send someone to get it. Just don't disturb the villagers there. Yili nodded and said, Thank you, teacher. Dr. Lin coldly glanced at the two of them, then got up and walked into the room. Looking at his back, Emo Xiaoyao put down his teacup and said, Lili, there's something wrong with him. And? Yili raised her eyebrows and looked at him with a smile. Emo Xiaoyao coldly said, You said that Tanjiji is his adopted son, and he has feelings for Tanjiji. But just now, he didn't even ask about Tanjiji. Yili smiled and said, He lives in this fu. How could he not know that Tanjiji has already left? Emo Xiaoyao shook his head, but he shouldn't have no reaction at all. Regardless of whether it was worry, disappointment, or something else, this old man acted as if Tanjiji was completely unrelated to him. It seemed deliberate. Lowering his head to look at Yili, Emo Xiaoyao softly said, I don't believe that Lili didn't see through it. Yili picked up a strand of silver hair in front of his chest and softly said, So, what if he's hiding something? Who doesn't have a secret? As long as he can help your body, I don't want to make things too difficult for him. After all, he is my savior. Yili was very grateful towards Dr. Lin. She knew that Dr. Lin must have some secrets in his heart. He was different from Tanjiji. Tanjiji cared too much about his so-called treasure and often arbitrarily suspected his adoptive father who raised him since he was a child. He neglected Dr. Lin himself. But Yili was watching from the side, carefully observing everyone around her. Not a single expression or look from Dr. Lin could escape her eyes. No matter what secrets Dr. Lin had, as long as he didn't hurt anyone she cared about, as long as he could help Xiaoyao's body, what else did it matter? Emo Xiaoyao watched as Yili played with the silver hair in front of her chest. Of course, he knew that Yili felt guilty about this. He gently pulled away Yili's hand and pulled out the strand of hair. He said dotingly, Since Miss Li said so, then we don't need to care about him. He would send someone to investigate Dr. Lin. As long as he didn't do anything he shouldn't do, he wouldn't do anything to him. When Dr. Lin came out of the house, he saw the two of them sitting under the tree and talking softly. The atmosphere around them was so warm and quiet that he couldn't bear to disturb them. Yili and Emo Xiaoyao were both strong cultivators. Before Dr. Lin even stepped out of the door, they had already heard his footsteps. Yili turned her head and looked at him. Dr. Lin threw a green porcelain bottle to her and said, There's nothing I can do about his hair. This is for you. He didn't say what the medicine was for. After saying this, Dr. Lin didn't send them off and directly went back to his room with his hands behind his back. They both knew that a person like Emo Xiaoyao wouldn't use medicine from a stranger. Naturally, it would need to be checked by a skilled doctor. Since it was like this, it didn't matter if he didn't tell them how to use the medicine. Yili took the porcelain bottle and opened it to smell it. She roughly understood the use of this bottle. When she was at Dr. Lin's house, she had seen many of his precious medicines. Putting away the medicine bottle, Yili stood up with Emo Xiaoyao's help and planned to see Xinyang again. Although she believed that Dr. Lin wouldn't do anything to the medicine bottle, she still needed to check it. Dr. Lin also said that he wanted to see Xinyang, so she needed to talk to Mr. Shin first. When she arrived at Xinyang's little courtyard, Feng Zhiyao and Zhou Yu were also there. Yili wasn't familiar with Zhou Yu. They had only met a few times. Although Yi Li had done Zhou Yu some favors, in the end, it was the Yi family's fault. So Yili hadn't taken it to heart. She didn't think that Zhou Yu would remember and send a letter for Du Qua without caring about his own safety. Seeing the two come in, the three quickly stood and bowed, greetings to the prince and princess. Emo Xiaoyao waved his hand, gesturing for the three of them to dispense with the formalities. He helped Yili sit down on the chair before turning to sit beside her and asked, Feng San, what are you doing here at this time? Don't I give you enough work to do? And Zhou Yu, are you unwell? With a glance, Emo Xiaoyao could see that Zhou Yu's complexion was slightly gray. He clearly wasn't well. Hearing Emo Xiaoyao's words, Feng Zhiyao almost spat out a mouthful of blood. He stared with grief and anger at the man in front of him who had a leisurely and unashamed expression. Ever since Wang Fei had returned, The man who had spent his days and nights on official business had completely changed. He would never spend more than 4 hours on official business. After dinner, he would never enter the study. Every day, he would stay by Wang Fei's side and ask about her well-being. Not only did he not work hard, he also didn't allow Wang Fei to work. He said it was to take care of the future heir of the Prince Ding mansion, the future young master of the Mahist army. So, as a subordinate, what else could he say? But when a half-dead subordinate who worked so hard was facing his leisurely and idle master and was questioned if he had too much free time, how could he endure it? Yili glared helplessly at Emo Xiuyao. She looked with a smile at Zhou Yu and asked, "Is official Zhou unwell?" Zhou Yu stood and respectfully said, "This one is no longer working in court. Wang Fei can call me Zhou Yu. I just caught a cold. Thank you for your concern, Prince Wang Fei." Feng Jiao twisted his mouth and said, "What do you mean by caught a cold? This person is almost as hardworking as third brother. Tian only sleeps when it's almost midnight. When I went over, he had fainted. I say, Prince, are you in a good mood now? If you're not in a bad mood, why don't you arrange for the appointments of the officials in the Northwest?" Exposed by Feng Jiao, Zhou Yu lowered his head in embarrassment. Emo Xiuyao leaned back in his chair and said lazily, "Appointments of officials? You didn't do anything?" Feng Jiao gritted his teeth. "Prince, I heard that this subordinate is just a minor deputy general." Emo Xiuyao nodded in understanding and said, "You are reminding me to promote you? Emo Xiuyao, you think this prince doesn't dare to beat you?" Feng Jiao was finally enraged. His image as an elegant young master was completely gone. These past few months, he had carefully worked himself to death. It was fine if this young master didn't have the slightest bit of gratitude, but after Wang Fei came back, he became even worse. If they hadn't grown up together, this young master wouldn't have served such a difficult master. "You want to beat me?" Emo Xiuyao narrowed his eyes dangerously. Feng Jiao couldn't help but swallow and look at Yili on the side. It wasn't that he didn't dare to beat Emo Xiuyao. When he was young, he didn't care about beating him up. The problem was, he couldn't beat him. Ever since Emo Xiuyao finished his apprenticeship, every time he fought, he would be the one to be beaten. "Xiuyao." Yili couldn't stand it anymore and called out in a soft voice. Emo Xiuyao sat up and said seriously, "I know. The situation a few days ago was a bit chaotic, so I didn't have time to deal with these things. I will do well in the next 2 days. Zhou Yu, you've managed Riyang City well. You can be the Riyang governor for now. Later, choose a few capable people to help you." These past few months, the Mahist army had been very chaotic. Many empty positions had appeared in the Northwest after the change of ownership. Even though the Mahist army was filled with elites, it wasn't the imperial court. There weren't that many civil officials waiting to be replaced. Therefore, many times, one person held multiple positions, and some generals even temporarily took over the civil duties. As for Su Qingze, who was both capable and trusted by Emo Xiuyao, he was directly sent to Hangzhou to manage the affairs of the 3 provinces in the Northwest. Because of this, Yili hadn't seen Su Qingze since she came back. Chapter 413. This official thanks the prince for his trust. Zhou Yu once again stood and expressed his thanks. Everyone understood what it meant for Prince Ding to personally appoint an official. According to the rules, the appointment and removal of officials had to be done by the imperial court. Now, Emo Xiuyao's actions had vaguely indicated that the Northwest would gradually leave the imperial court. This caused many people to have mixed feelings. Some were happy, some were worried. Rest for 2 days first. Let your body recover. Yili urged. If your body collapsed, then don't think about anything else. Right now, the Northwest was lacking in talent. Looking at the attitudes of Feng Jiao and Emo Xiuyao, Zhou Yu was clearly a capable person despite his young age. Zhou Yu nodded and said, "Wang Fei, thank you for your advice." At the side, Shenyang looked discontentedly at the crowd and said, "Does everyone still remember that this is not a study for discussion?" 3 out of 4 people were not healthy, yet they dared to discuss such nonsense in front of him, a doctor. Zhou Yu clearly just remembered that this was Shenyang's courtyard. He hurriedly suppressed the excitement and joy in his heart and said apologetically to Shenyang, "This one has been rude. Mr. Shen, please forgive me." Shenyang waved his hand and took out a piece of paper, saying, "Go get the medicine yourself. If you don't want to fall on the bed and be unable to get up, then go ahead." Then, without waiting for Zhou Yu's reaction, he turned to examine Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao and said, "Prince, does Wang Fei feel unwell?" Mo Xiaoyao shook his head and said, "First take Yi Li's pulse. In the future, take a pulse every 3 days. Mr. Shen, I'll trouble you." Shenyang knew that Wang Fei's health was important right now and nodded unconcernedly. In his mind, he planned to postpone the closed-door research plan. At least wait until Wang Fei saw the child born. Taking Yi Li's pulse, Shenyang said, "Wang Fei's health is good. While she has been weak in the past few months, she has recovered well and will not affect Wang Fei. The little Shitzi may be weak when he is born, but he can recover." After all, during the most important months of the baby's life, Wang Fei had been in a coma. In reality, Shenyang had to praise the doctor's medical skills for being able to keep the child. Mo Xiaoyao nodded. "I'll have to trouble Mr. Shen in the future." Shenyang took back his hand and raised an eyebrow as he asked, "In these few months, Wang Fei should have met a good doctor. Can this one take a look at the doctor's prescription?" Yi Li didn't mind. She reported a few prescriptions that Dr. Lin had prescribed for him before. Shenyang didn't care about anything else. He quickly took notes and praised it repeatedly. Yi Li smiled and said, "Dr. Lin is in this house right now. He also wants to advise Mr. Shen. If Mr. Chen has the time, you might as well visit Dr. Lin. The two of you can also exchange pointers." Shenyang was overjoyed. He clapped his hands and said with a smile, "That's great. I will definitely visit tomorrow." Yi Li took out the porcelain bottle that Dr. Lin had given her and handed it over. She said, "This was given by Dr. Lin just now. Mr. Shen, why don't you take a look at it and see what it is?" Shenyang carefully took it. He lowered his head to smell it and thought for a moment. He took out some and rubbed it on his hand. After examining it for a moment, he smiled and said, "This should be an elixir to remove old scars. There is a large amount of lingxiang grass in it. It really is a rare item." Finishing, he looked at Mo Xiaoyao's masked face. He smiled and said, "This isn't for Wang Fei. It should be for the prince, right? The prince can try it. Later, this one can modify the prescription to see if it can have a better effect."
Shenyang,
Mo Xiaoyao said with a dark face and gritted his teeth. For a man to care so much about his face made people feel uncomfortable. However, Mo Xiaoyao had to admit that he really did hope that this medicine would be effective. If he had to have a head full of white hair, then at least he should have a perfect face. Otherwise, wouldn't he be mocked by others? Shenyang did not care if Mo Xiaoyao was angry or not. He chuckled and returned the medicine bottle to Yi Li. In Shenyang's view, the present Mo Xiaoyao was better than before. When a person did not care about their own face and body, it meant that there was nothing in the world worth caring about. Now that Mo Xiaoyao was willing to care about his face, it at least meant that there was someone he cared about. As long as someone he cared about was alive, there was always hope. Without waiting for Mo Xiaoyao to explode, Shenyang waved his hand and chased them out. After leaving Shenyang's courtyard, Zhou Yu bid farewell and left the Fu. Before he left, he glanced at Mo Xiaoyao in surprise. He was still very young, so it was a bit of a shock to see the famous king of Ding being driven out mercilessly after being angered by a doctor to the point that his face turned green. Watching Zhou Yu leave, Yi Li asked, "Zhou Yu is too young. Is he good enough to be the Riyang prefect?" Compared to the group of prefects in the northwest who had been pushed to the bottom by Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao, Zhou Yu, who had just turned 20, was too young. Feng Jiao nodded and said, "His abilities are enough, but his age is too young. But in Prince's view, there is no harm, right?" Mo Xiaoyao smiled coldly and said, "It's fine as long as his abilities are enough. Clean up those people who are just waiting to die. If anyone dares to have any dissatisfaction, let them come to I." Feng Jiao nodded in satisfaction and said with a smile, "With Prince, things will be much easier." However, Zhou Yu counts as one of Wang Fei's people. I'm afraid that when the time comes, those old men will come out and nag that Wang Fei is a girl. The trouble was that they couldn't kill all of those old men. After all, it was important to calm the people's hearts. These old men were all important people in the Northwest. It would be better to say something like a famous scholar, a loyal minister, a great philanthropist who paved the way, or something like that. There really was no way to move them. It wasn't as if Yi Li hadn't heard these words before. Back when she was leading the army, she had already heard the words of those stubborn old men. She smiled and said, "Since His Highness and Feng Xin both think that Zhou Yu is useful, then it shall be him. As for what those old men have to say, they don't need to find Prince. They can just find Ben Fei." Feng Zhiao blinked and rubbed his forehead as he looked at the couple. Forget it. If he really allowed those old people to come and bother Wang Fei, Wang Ye would kill them. He had experienced the skills of those pedantic scholars. It was nothing now, but in the future, Feng Zhiao felt that it would be a disaster. Late at night in the governor's manor. The moon was dark and the wind was strong. It was the time that night walkers liked the most. A black shadow flew up the walls of the governor's manor and silently landed in the flower bed next to the wall. Then, more black-clothed people snuck in from behind the walls and headed towards a certain place in the governor's manor. In a pavilion not far away, several pairs of eyes saw the black-clothed people through the half-open window. In the pavilion, Emo Xiaoyao sat lazily on a soft couch under the faint candlelight, looking down at the night sky. Beside him, Feng Xiao, Han Mingxi, Qin Feng, Zhu Jing, Emo Hua, and the others sat or stood, leisurely admiring the black-clothed people's actions. Han Mingyue leaned against the window. Her face was pale and tired, but her gaze did not move at all. She stared intently at the black-clothed people below. Feng Zhiao fiddled with the exquisite desserts on the table beside him and asked in confusion, "Are these people really stupid or pretending to be stupid?" Prince Ding's place was so easy for them to break in, but they didn't suspect anything? If Mo Jingqi or Lei Jinting's place was so easy for them to break in, the first thing they would do would be to suspect something was amiss. They wouldn't go in so boldly. Qin Feng hugged his sword in front of him and snorted. "I'm afraid these people are just cannon fodder sent to test the waters. The other party must know how strict Prince Ding's manor security is before they take action." Mo Hua nodded in agreement with Qin Feng's words. Based on the standard of an ordinary assassin, these people were too weak. Is it Tanjiji? Chapter 414. Zhuo Jing said in a low voice, "We just left the Northwest, and he can't wait." Han Mingxi lowered his eyebrows and laughed. That proves that he really can't wait to take Su Zuidi's life. It looks like Miss Su really is hiding some important secret? Qin Feng, can you do it or not? Su Zuidi has been in your hands for several months. Qin Feng's face couldn't help but darken at the mention of this matter. He glanced at Han Mingyue, who was standing at the side with her back straight, and complained, "This woman is really a bit difficult to deal with. After several months of torment, she's pretty much spilled everything except for Tanjiji." Spilled everything? Han Mingxi sneered, making it clear that he didn't believe it. A group of people who claimed to be professional interrogators couldn't even deal with a useless woman after several months. How could they have the nerve to say that she spilled everything? Qin Feng glared at him angrily and said, "That's right, including how many men she slept with." After saying this, Qin Feng felt that he had said something wrong. This Su Zuidi was once the prince's fiancée, but from the information obtained from the interrogation, she didn't seem to be the one who accepted the gift. Wouldn't this make the prince's face look bad? He carefully glanced at Emo Xiaoyao, but found that Emo Xiaoyao was leaning against the soft couch with his forehead propped up in a daze. There was even a faint smile on his face, and he didn't look angry. Qin Feng could only pray that perhaps the prince didn't hear what he said. Just as he was thinking, Emo Xiaoyao had already sat up, his long white hair casually draped over his body. Compared to his previous calm and indifference, there was a bit more coldness and alienation. Glancing at Qin Feng, Emo Xiaoyao said lightly, "Don't worry, don't kill her before you get the information out." Of course, if you have other channels to get the information, you don't have to report it to me and the princess. What he meant was that he only wanted Suzui's secret. As for Suzui's life and death, it was up to Qin Feng to decide. Qin Feng couldn't help but shrink his neck. Did Prince really hear what he said? He had to follow the princess consort for the next few days. No, he had to go on a long journey to settle some matters. As for Suzui, Qin Feng glanced at Han Mingxi with some distress. He didn't care. Since Prince didn't care, even if he killed Suzui, he could just find a way to capture Tan Jiji and interrogate him later. But at least he had a good relationship with Han Mingxi, and Han Mingxi happened to be Han Mingyue's younger brother. So, Suzui, that woman should be assassinated, right? Seeing the black-clothed man's figure disappear into the most remote courtyard of the administration office, Mo Hua waved his hand and signaled to the outside, indicating that it was time to reel in the net. Not long after, the lights in the courtyard lit up and the faint sound of weapons clashing could be heard. Mo Xiaoyao frowned and said, "Tell them to hurry up. Don't let the princess consort rest." Prince Mo Hua said, "Don't worry, Prince. The sound won't reach the princess consort's courtyard." In order to not let the people in the main courtyard rest, the prison cells were specially placed in the most remote area of the administration office. Moreover, the shadow guards had a sense of propriety. Even they could only hear a faint sound from here, not to mention that the princess consort's courtyard was half a journey away. Sure enough, in less than a quarter of an hour, the lights in the distant courtyard were extinguished and the administration office returned to its original tranquility. Qin Feng frowned and said, "I'm afraid there will be a lot of assassins these days. This subordinate doesn't understand why Suzui has to be moved back to the administration office. It would be better to put her in Qilin's residence, where no one would be disturbed." Zhua Jing said, "If we put her there, the assassins won't have to come, because they wouldn't be able to find her." Feng Jiao saw that there was nothing else, so he stood up and stretched his body. He yawned and said, "If there's nothing else, this subordinate will take his leave." Mo Xiaoyao casually nodded his head. Feng Jiao took 2 steps outside and seemed to have thought of something. He turned around and said, "That's right, Your Highness, according to the pace, Su Qingze should be arriving tomorrow. I heard that there are 2 other young masters of the Su family with him." Mo Xiaoyao's face darkened, and he glanced coldly at Feng Jiao. He asked, "Why didn't I hear you say this before?" There was a gloating smile in Feng Jiao's eyes. He shrugged his shoulders and said, This subordinate only received the news when I was having dinner. At that time, the prince was accompanying the princess consort for dinner. This subordinate didn't dare to disturb them." Mo Xiaoyao huffed softly and said, "Go make the arrangements. There's no place to stay in the Fu. Go to the city and find a residence for them to stay in." Feng Jiao shook his head. "Prince, I'm afraid that won't do. Second young Master Su's residence is still empty. If the princess consort asks why the 3 young masters of the Su family are living outside the Fu, how should this subordinate answer?" These days, Mo Xiaoyao wanted to chase out everyone who was living in the governor's Fu. The first to bear the brunt of his anger were Feng Jiao, Zhu Jing, Lin Han, and Wei Lin, who often appeared in front of Yili. But the 3 of them were the princess consort's personal assistants and were originally supposed to live in the Fu. So Feng Jiao alone bore all of Mo Xiaoyao's anger. But Feng Jiao suddenly experienced the joy of living with everyone and refused to move out of the Fu to live in an independent residence. So every day, under Mo Xiaoyao's ravaging, he happily busied himself with work. Now that he had the chance to make trouble for Mo Xiaoyao, Feng Jiao naturally spared no effort. "Feng San." Mo Xiaoyao's expression was dark as he softly said, "Get lost." Feng Jiao shrugged and didn't care at all about Mo Xiaoyao's words. People who were in a bad mood had a reason to vent. Feng Jiao raised his hands and smiled. "This subordinate will leave. This subordinate will properly arrange a residence for the 3 young masters of the Su family, especially 5th young Master Su. I heard that he plans to stay in Riyang to accompany the princess consort. 5th young Master Su is still young and can accompany the princess consort so that she won't be bored." Prince, don't you think so? It's fine if you don't want to work, but you don't want the princess consort to do it. As far as he knew, fifth young master Su wasn't easy to deal with. When the time comes, you'll be depressed to death.
Feng San.
Mo Xiaoyao suddenly smiled. He looked at Feng Zhiyao and said, "Now that you've reminded me, I remember. This Fu is indeed lacking a chief steward. Uncle Mo just happens to need to take care of the various properties. How about you be the chief steward of this Fu in the future?" Feng Zhiyao's expression froze, and he hurriedly retreated in defeat. The distinguished and accomplished third young master Feng was going to become the chief steward of the Wang Fu? Compared to the various chief stewards of the various manors in the world, Feng Zhiyao instantly felt that his image as a peerless and elegant young master had collapsed. The other people also left. Only the two brothers Han Mingxi and Han Mingyue remained. The pavilion was silent. Mo Xiaoyao raised his hand and poured himself a cup of wine. He held it in his hand and absent-mindedly sipped. As he pondered what Feng Zhiyao had just said, he wasn't in the mood to speak. Su Qingze was in Hangzhou, Su Qingyan was in Yinzhou, and Su Qingfeng was in the Guanyi barracks. How did the three of them get together? Most importantly, why did the three of them come to Riyang instead of staying put? Right now, Mo Xiaoyao didn't want anyone related to Yi Li to appear in the Fu and draw away Li Li's attention. But the three of them deserved to die. It was obvious that Li Li was very important. As he was lost in thought, a gloomy coldness unconsciously spread out. The atmosphere in the originally cold room became even more solemn and gloomy. Chapter 415. Xiaoyao. After hesitating for a moment, Han Mingyue still opened his mouth. Mo Xiaoyao looked up at him, his eyes filled with obvious impatience. Then he lightly swept a glance at Han Mingxi. Han Mingxi helplessly frowned. In the past, Han Mingxi dared to provoke Mo Xiaoyao without any hesitation because he could clearly see Mo Xiaoyao's character. But ever since Yi Li's accident and his return, Han Mingxi felt that he couldn't understand Mo Xiaoyao anymore. Just like before, he was sure that Mo Xiaoyao wouldn't do anything to him because of Yi Li. But now, even though he knew that Mo Xiaoyao wouldn't do anything to him, but every time he saw Mo Xiaoyao's gaze on him, Han Mingxi wasn't so sure. So now, under normal circumstances, he wouldn't provoke Mo Xiaoyao. Thinking of this, Han Mingxi couldn't help but smile bitterly. This was the difference between him and Mo Xiaoyao. Without strength, he didn't have the qualifications to compete with Mo Xiaoyao for Junwei's attention. Han Mingxi understood that Mo Xiaoyao was warning him that if Han Mingyue didn't know how to restrain himself, then he wouldn't be polite. But what could Han Mingxi do? No matter how muddle-headed Han Mingyue was, he was still his only big brother. He raised him, loved him, taught him how to shelter him from the wind and rain. No matter how much he couldn't understand why his talented big brother would be so dead set on abandoning everything for a woman who wasn't worth it, no matter how angry he was at Han Mingyue for abandoning his family and himself, when Han Mingyue was in danger, he still had to beg Yi Li. Han Mingxi also understood why Mo Xiaoyao didn't do anything to Han Mingyue. It wasn't because he cared about their brotherhood, but because he knew that he would have to beg Yi Li. And Mo Xiaoyao didn't want him to beg Yi Li, and didn't want him to have too much contact with Yi Li. Sighing helplessly, Han Mingxi got up and said, "Big brother, you should go back first. I still have things to discuss with Prince." Han Mingyue frowned. Looking at his brother's tired appearance, he couldn't bear to pester him and make things difficult for him. He could give up everything for Su Zuidi, but that didn't include his little brother. Seeing Han Mingyue walk out, Han Mingxi let out a sigh of relief and sat down again. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows in surprise as he looked at Han Mingxi, who was sitting opposite him. Han Mingxi's handsome face had a trace of helplessness. He looked at Mo Xiaoyao and said, "Prince, I beg you to help my big brother." Mo Xiaoyao's lips hooked up in a cold smile. "Beg me? Han Mingxi. You beg I to help your big brother? I don't see how Han Mingyue needs help. He's obviously happy to do it. What's more, why should I help?" Han Mingxi gritted his teeth and said, "I know that Su Zuidi is doomed. I only beg Prince to let my big brother live when the time comes." A dead end? Emo Xiaoyao sat up and looked at Han Mingxi. He looked at him with interest and asked, "Why don't you beg I to let Su Zuidi go and help Han Mingyue? Although I won't agree with your friendship with Li if you beg her, she won't refuse you." Speaking of his friendship with Li, Emo Xiaoyao gnashed his teeth. Of all the people around Li, he hated Han Mingxi the most, but he promised Li not to kill Han Mingxi. But every time he saw the way Han Mingxi looked at Li, he wanted to gouge his eyes out. Han Mingxi was silent for a moment and said with a bitter smile, "Prince, why ask when you already know the answer? If it was before, I might really beg the princess to be merciful. But now, the secret that Su Zuidi is unwilling to say must be very important. Once it is said, she will die without a doubt. Although I don't know what it is now, but when the time comes, I'm afraid, the princess may not be able to make the decision. What's more," Han Mingxi sneered and said, "Who is Su Zuidi to me? Why should this young master beg for her? If she had died earlier, there wouldn't be so many problems now." "You see things more clearly than Han Mingyue," Emo Xiaoyao said lightly. Both of them understood that it wasn't that Han Mingyue couldn't see things clearly, but that he didn't want to admit it. The once world-famous young master Mingyu had already fallen into a trap and couldn't wake up because of Su Zuidi. It was said that a beauty's home was a hero's grave, and this sentence was indeed true. But there's one thing that you're wrong about. There's nothing in the Ding Palace that Li can't decide. Looking at the silent Han Mingxi, Emo Xiaoyao continued, "As long as Li is happy, not to mention Su Zuidi's life, even if she wants Ai's life, I will send it to her hands. Of course, it's right that you didn't beg Li. If you make things difficult for Li, I will make things difficult for everyone. Han Mingyue's life, you can keep it for yourself. I have no interest in it. But you better remember clearly, if you dare to use your eyes to stare at Ai's Li again, I will dig your eyes out." Han Mingxi only felt bitterness in his throat. Emo Xiaoyao's stare was naturally not a normal stare. Yi Li had so many people around her, and there were many who were closer to her than him. Emo Xiaoyao didn't warn Feng Zhiyao, Qin Feng, Zhui Jinglin, Han Weilin, but calmly warned him. Han Mingxi naturally knew the reason. Although he had always thought that he had concealed it well, but even if he could hide it from others, he couldn't hide it from Emo Xiaoyao, who was Yi Li's husband. Raising his head and looking at Emo Xiaoyao, Han Mingxi sneered, "Prince must also know that Prince is a rare woman. Could it be that Prince can block the eyes of the world? Or does Prince want to hide Junwei in a boudoir and not let anyone see her?" Emo Xiaoyao's eyes turned cold, and his smile became even colder. "I naturally won't hide Li in a boudoir. No matter where Ai is, Li will definitely be by Ai's side. But if anyone dares to look at her, I will dig their eyes out." Han Mingxi felt a chill in his heart, but he had nothing to say. "You're just lucky to meet her first." Emo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows, and there was pride in his expression. "So what if Ai's luck is good? Han Mingxi, remember your duty. I promised Li that I wouldn't kill you. You better not force Ai to break my promise." Han Mingxi lowered his head and was silent for a long time. Then he raised his head and smiled faintly at him. "Prince, think about it. Han Mingxi doesn't have any improper thoughts. I'm just friends with Emo Xiaoyao. Does Prince want to stop me?" He knew that he couldn't compare to Emo Xiaoyao. "Mr. Feng, you made it sound nice, but he was just a flower thief with no ability." Junwei didn't mind his reputation and was willing to be friends with him. However, in this chaotic world, he couldn't protect her. Ever since Han Mingxi met Yi Li, he had never regretted that he was always lazy and didn't listen to his older brother's teachings during the new year. In the end, he didn't have any accomplishments in literature or martial arts. If he had the same talent, intelligence, and martial arts as his older brother, even if he couldn't compare to Emo Xiaoyao, he would still have the confidence to compete with him. Emo Xiaoyao narrowed his eyes and looked suspiciously at the handsome man in front of him. Although he was extremely disgusted with the extraordinarily handsome man in front of him, Emo Xiaoyao had to admit that he was helping Ollie wholeheartedly. Also, Li needed friends of her own. To put it bluntly, Emo Xiaoyao, was just jealous of Han Mingxi. Han Mingxi's appearance was better than his, and his personality was better than his. Although Han Mingxi's martial arts weren't better than his, and his status was extraordinary, what was the use? If it were Han Mingxi, he would naturally not hesitate to take Li Li and retire to the mountains to live a peaceful life. He was just afraid that Li Li would prefer a man like Han Mingxi. He was afraid that Li Li would regret marrying him. No matter what, no one in this world could take Li Li away from him. Chapter 416. This king will believe you this time, but you have to remember that this king's words will always be effective. Mo Xiaoyao stood up and indifferently left these words behind before flicking his sleeves and leaving. Han Mingxi sat alone by the window as he watched Mo Xiaoyao walk down the stairs, through the garden, and towards the lieutenant general's courtyard. That place held the only woman in his life that had moved his heart. A light breeze blew through the window, and Han Mingxi felt a chill in his heart. Just as Feng Jiao had said, the three young masters of the Su family arrived at Riyang City early the next morning. Just by looking at their exhausted bodies, it was obvious that they had traveled through the night. This made Mo Xiaoyao, who had not yet told Yili this news, feel unhappy. Why did they have to travel so quickly? It's not like Li would run away. However, he did not think about how happy the Su family would be when they found out that Yili was still alive. The fact that they did not come to the northwest was already because the situation did not allow it. Otherwise, he would have even more worries. Yi Li, on the other hand, was overjoyed at the arrival of the three brothers. Recently, she had been very idle. The two doctors did not allow her to handle any official business. Mo Xiaoyao was even more strict. He did not even allow her to touch needlework. Every day, other than eating and sleeping, she could only stroll around the manor's garden and occasionally read a book. Yili felt that she had never been so idle in her 2 lifetimes. After going through a life and death situation, she was naturally excited and happy to see her family again. Second brother, third brother, fifth brother, you guys, older sister Li. The youngest, Su Qingyan, was unable to contain his joy. As usual, he went up to Yili to talk. Mo Xiaoyao, who was standing to the side, raised his hand to separate the two. He smiled faintly and said, "Fifth brother, Li Li is pregnant now. You must be careful."
Huh?
It was only now that Su Qingyan realized that his cousin was no longer as light and slender as she used to be. Her body was still not round, and her belly was still bulging. Su Qingyan couldn't help but stare at Yi Li pitifully. He even ignored the strange way Mo Xiaoyao had addressed him. Su Qingza, who was sitting at the side, raised his eyebrows and looked at Mo Xiaoyao calmly. Yili patted Su Qingyan with a smile and said, "Long time no see. Fifth brother has grown a lot taller.
Sit down and talk."
Seeing Yili being helped to the head seat by Mo Xiaoyao, Su Qingyan blinked unwillingly. He looked at Yili and could only sit down next to Su Qingfeng. He was the youngest in the Su family. Everyone else, including Su Qingbai, was older than Yi Li by half a year. He was the only one who was Yi Li's younger brother. The age difference between the two wasn't that big. They grew up together. Unlike the other brothers who protected Yi Li, Su Qingyan was the one who was protected by Yi Li. He never treated Yi Li as his cousin. He only thought of her as his biological sister. When the Su family moved out of Beijing, they cried endlessly because Yi Li couldn't go with them. They almost stayed in Beijing as well. Although Su Qingbai was young, he didn't miss Mo Xiaoyao's possessiveness. His dissatisfaction with Mo Xiaoyao grew exponentially. This fellow caused Sister Li to do so much for him and almost lost her life. What was the meaning of this? He actually dared to guard against this young master? The revenge of a young man was terrifying. Su Qingyan decided on the spot that if Mo Xiaoyao didn't let him pester Sister Li, then he would pester Sister Li. Mo Xiaoyao obviously noticed Su Qingyan's provocative gaze. His phoenix eyes slightly darkened as he coldly glanced at Su Qingyan. His eyes were full of threat.
Who was Su Qingyan?
How could he be frightened by a mere glance? He raised his eyebrows and grinned at Mo Xiaoyao. While the two of them were fighting fiercely, Yi Li and Su Qingfeng were chatting happily. Yili looked at Su Qingfeng, who seemed to have calmed down a lot after not seeing him for a long time. She asked curiously, second brother, third brother, and fifth brother, why are they together? Su Qingfeng laughed and said, I was originally in the northwest. Little Wu, on the other hand, ran to the northwest overnight when she heard that something happened to you. However, she got lost and went to the south. I happened to find her, so I brought her with me to the northwest. What Su Qingfeng didn't say was that he had brought Su Qingyan and Su Qingyan around Hong Province for a month or two, hoping to find Yili by chance. In the end, they met Su Qingze, who had gone to Hong Province to take up a post. Only then did the three brothers get together. However, Su Qingfeng and Su Qingyan's whereabouts weren't suitable for outsiders to know, so Su Qingze didn't even mention it to Mo Xiuyao. During those months, Mo Xiuyao was distracted and didn't pay attention to these matters. Yili frowned and said, Isn't third brother in the army? Su Qingfeng's identity was special. If he wanted to leave, it was impossible for him to not attract the attention of the higher-ups. She couldn't help but suspect that Su Qingfeng had become a deserter. Su Qingfeng waved his hand and said with a smile, The emperor doesn't really want our Su family to produce another general. I only said that little Five had run away from home, and I wanted to go find him, and it was approved in a few days. Yili felt a bit apologetic. She knew that Su Qingfeng had been ostracized quite a bit in the army. This wasn't just because he was the son of the Su family, but also because he was Princess Ding's older cousin. How are grandfather and uncle? Where are big brother and fourth brother? Yili asked anxiously. The Shadow Guard had also sent back this information, but it wasn't as reassuring as hearing it from her own family. Su Qingze calmly said, The Southwest is currently at war. Old Fourth has been summoned back to the capital. Eldest uncle wants him and father to resign and live in seclusion. However, the emperor might not agree. Grandfather and father are fine, but big brother? Su Qingze frowned and said, Big brother only sent a message saying that he's in the south, but we don't know where he is or what he's doing. Young Master Qingchen's whereabouts were unknown. Even the Shadow Guard and Tianyi Pavilion might not be able to find him. If he didn't say anything, no one could be sure of his whereabouts. Yili frowned slightly and said, Currently, only Mo Jingqi knows about fourth brother's whereabouts in the Su family. Will Mo Jingqi become suspicious of the Su family because of this? Su Qingfeng sneered and said, When did he stop being suspicious of the Su family? As long as grandfather is still alive and the Su family hasn't openly rebelled, he won't do anything to grandfather, eldest uncle, and father, even if it's for the sake of his reputation. Third brother. Su Qingze frowned and glanced at Su Qingfeng disapprovingly. Su Qingfeng snorted and remained silent. Yili frowned. She understood the history of the Su family. Yili felt that she somewhat understood the thoughts of her grandfather and uncle. Now that big brother was in the south, second brother, third brother, and fifth brother were in the northwest, even if the emperor really wanted to do something to the Su family, he wouldn't be able to catch them all in one fell swoop. As long as grandfather and eldest uncle were still in Yunzhou, and as long as second uncle was still in the capital, even if the Su family and Ding King's estate were inextricably linked because of her, the emperor wouldn't dare to rashly say that the Su family had disloyal intentions. After all, the Su family was the head of the world's literati. Their influence could definitely be said to be boundless. If they really forced the Su family into a corner, Mo Jingqi wouldn't be able to escape. Grandfather and eldest uncle were buying time for the Northwest. Taking a deep breath, Yili planned to make a trip to Yunzhou when she went to the capital to retrieve the Biluo flower. Chapter 417. The three of them chatted for less than an hour before Mo Xiuyao stood up and smiled at Yili. Yili, it's time to let Mr. Shin take your pulse. Let Qingze and the others rest as well. They rushed here overnight. Let's hold a banquet to welcome them tonight. Yili glanced at the travel-worn trio and said in annoyance, I forgot that second brother, third brother, and fifth brother must have been tired from the journey. I just kept chatting with you. Second brother, your courtyard is still open. Go wash up and rest with third brother and fifth brother. We'll talk about it later. Su Qingyan blinked his eyes and looked at Yili. Sisterly, little five hasn't spoken much with Sisterly yet. Yili smiled and looked at the youth, who was a head taller than her. She smiled and said, Second brother's courtyard is just beside the main courtyard. We have plenty of time. When you've rested enough, you can come and talk to me at any time. Su Qingyan's eyes lit up and he smiled happily. Really? He glanced suspiciously at a certain someone and said, When the time comes, there won't be anyone who won't allow Qingyan to talk to Sisterly, right? Yili patted his head and smiled.
How can that be?
Little five is sister's only younger brother. Who would dare to stop you from talking to me? Su Qingyan proudly glanced at Emo Xiaoyao. Emo Xiaoyao's eyes darkened, and he glanced at Su Qingyan. He smiled and said, Li is right. If Sisterly wants to talk to fifth brother, you can talk to him at any time. Fifth brother is still young and has plenty of time. What he meant was that other than chatting with Yi Li, Su Qingyan was just a good-for-nothing who didn't know how to eat and drink. Su Qingyan gritted his teeth and smiled even more brightly. Brother-in-law is right. I will always be by Sister Li's side. Sister Li will be lonely and bored when brother-in-law is busy with political affairs. After personally sending Su Qingza and the others back to their courtyard to rest, Yili looked amusedly at Emo Xiaoyao, who had a dark expression on his face. She sighed softly. Little five is still a child. Why are you being so calculative with him? She had naturally seen the interaction between Su Qingyan and Emo Xiaoyao earlier, but she had not said anything. At this moment, Emo Xiaoyao's face was so gloomy that ink was about to drip out. His thin lips were tightly pursed, and he looked even more like a child throwing a tantrum. Emo Xiaoyao snorted. After a while, he said, He's already 15 years old. How can he be considered a child? Yili raised a hand to pinch his handsome face. She smiled and said, Even if he's 20 years old, he's still my younger brother. After saying this, Yili looked Emo Xiaoyao up and down. She tilted her head and said, Speaking of which, Emo Xiaoyao, have you become addicted to jealousy recently? Aren't you afraid that you'll die from jealousy? It was one thing to be picky about Han Mingxi. Although Han Mingxi's thoughts had never been made clear, Yili knew a little about them. Therefore, she was not as close to Han Mingxi as she was to Feng Zhiyao or Qin Feng. However, if she was picky about Su Qingyan, then she was going overboard. Most importantly, Yili really didn't understand where Emo Xiaoyao's wariness came from. In Yili's opinion, whether it was martial arts, intelligence, or power, there were very few people in the world who could compare to Emo Xiaoyao. In the past, Emo Xiaoyao wasn't so unconfident in himself. If it was because he had just returned from his tribulation, then it would be a bit of an exaggeration to say that she hadn't recovered after half a month. Emo Xiaoyao trapped her in his arms. He lowered his head and gently bit her fragrant cherry lips. He said in a low voice, Can't I just be jealous? Li, you're not allowed to be nice to other men. I'll get angry. Yi Li was helpless. Little five isn't other men. Su Qingyan was her younger brother. She had treated him like her own little brother since he was young. Other than me, all other men are other men, Emo Xiaoyao said in a domineering tone. Yili almost wanted to roll her eyes at him. She grabbed his hand and placed it on her round belly. She smiled and asked, Then what about him? Both Mr. Shen and Dr. Lin said it was a boy. Is he also another man? Emo Xiaoyao said matter-of-factly, Of course. When he's born, I'll give him to Mr. Qingyun. The child taught by Mr. Qingyun will definitely be outstanding. Outstanding to the point that he hated it. If he didn't already know that Li only treated the members of the Su family as her brothers, and that the members of the Su family only treated Yi Li as their younger sister, he would have died of jealousy long ago. Under Yi Li's threatening gaze, Emo Xiaoyao unwillingly swallowed back the word throw and changed to a more euphemistic way of saying it. Yi Li felt that one day she would be angered to death by this man. She turned around in Emo Xiaoyao's arms to face him and raised her hand to pinch his face. Emo Xiaoyao, he's your son. Emo Xiaoyao narrowed his eyes and glanced at the round place. He snorted coldly. Other men? He didn't like that thing for a long time. If she wasn't pregnant, Lily wouldn't have almost died because of her difficulty in moving. If she wasn't pregnant, he wouldn't have to endure being unable to get close to Lily. All because that bastard Xinyang said. Thinking of Xinyang's gloating old face, Emo Xiuyao felt that this fellow hiding in Lily's stomach was even more of an eyesore. Of course, he was also wrong. He swore that when this child was born, he would never let Lily get pregnant again. It was dangerous, troublesome, and annoying. Towards such a childish man, Yili was completely helpless. However, looking at his aggrieved and stubborn eyes, Yili felt an inexplicable sense of cuteness and heartache. She couldn't bring herself to throw a tantrum. She pulled Emo Xiuyao to sit down. Yili didn't mind and sat on his lap. She turned his face to face her. "Young master, can we not be so childish?" Emo Xiuyao unhappily opened his mouth and bit Yili's slender fingers. However, he couldn't bear to use too much force and only lightly bit before letting go. "I am not childish. Even if I am, Lili, you can't dislike I." Leaning into Emo Xiuyao's embrace, Yili sighed softly. Xinyang had casually mentioned Emo Xiuyao's condition when he was taking her pulse. If it was a normal family, she wouldn't feel that there was anything wrong with it. His possessiveness was also proof that Emo Xiuyao truly loved her. Even though she was slightly worried right now, how could she not feel a trace of joy? However, right now, she couldn't let Emo Xiuyao lose all confidence in himself like this. She knew that her fall from the cliff had released all the negative emotions Emo Xiuyao had hidden in his heart, such as inferiority, resentment, and powerlessness. They had even been magnified infinitely. Even though Emo Xiuyao always seemed to blame her fall on the child, Genom of Gojoseon, Emo Jingqi, or even Su Zuidi in his heart, he truly felt that it was all his own fault. He felt that it was his inability to protect her that had caused her to meet with danger. Yili had always wanted to talk to him, but when faced with Emo Xiuyao, she didn't know how to start. "Xiuyao." She raised her hand and took off the mask on his face. Dr. Lin's medicine was indeed effective. Even though it had only been a few days, the scars on Emo Xiuyao's face had already changed. Even if it didn't completely disappear in the future, Yili believed that it would get much better. She raised her hand and hooked it around his neck. Yili gently kissed the scar on the left side of his face. Emo Xiuyao was startled. He hugged Yili as if he couldn't react for a moment. Yili kissed his cheek and said in a low voice, "Xiuyao, no matter how many people there are in the world, in my heart, only you are the most outstanding one. Do you understand?" Chapter 418. Emo Xiuyao's long eyelashes fluttered as he looked up at the beautiful woman with a sweet smile in front of him. His wife, the one and only woman he loved the most in this life. She said that in her heart, he was the only one who was the most outstanding. Those gentle words made his heart fill with boundless joy, even more so than when his father praised him when he was young. At the same time, it also made his heart fill with even more guilt and resentment. Why couldn't I have met you at the best time of my life? Xiuyao, in this world, there are many handsome, talented, and powerful men in this world. But I met you. I didn't meet the young master of the Prince Ding mansion, but you, the prince of the country, Emo Xiuyao. Do you understand? Xiuyao, if I met you 10 years ago, I definitely wouldn't have loved you. Yi Li softly muttered. 10 years ago, Emo Xiuyao was too young, so young that she, who had experienced 2 lives, felt that he was too young. At that time, that peerlessly beautiful and radiant youth was an existence that Yi Li would have avoided like the plague. And at that time, Emo Xiuyao also wouldn't have taken a fancy to a nameless daughter of the minister's mansion. It wasn't that the young Emo Xiuyao judged people based on appearance, but at that age, Emo Xiuyao probably didn't put any woman in his eyes. So even the world's #1 beauty like Su Zuidi was only a betrayed ex-fiancé in Emo Xiuyao's heart. There was no love, so there was no hate. If it wasn't for these 10 years of experience, Yili wouldn't have taken a fancy to Emo Xiuyao, and Emo Xiuyao wouldn't have fallen in love with Yili. They had met each other at their worst times, but Yili still felt that they had met the right person at the right time. Then, does Lily love me now? Mo Xiao asked in a low voice, his gaze unwaveringly looking at the beautiful face in front of him. He knew that Lily was right, but he couldn't imagine what would happen if he missed this woman in this life. I love you, Yili said in a low voice without hiding anything. She loved this man. She had unknowingly fallen in love with him. So she was willing to work hard for him, willing to do everything for him. So she was proud of his excellence, but at the same time, her heart ached for his pain and weakness. When a woman was willing to unconditionally indulge a man, she must love him. Lily and Mo Xiao sighed in satisfaction. He lowered his head and kissed the lips that he had been coveting for a long time. He pried open her teeth and provoked her to dance with him. Ali, I love you. And Mo Xiao will only love you in this life. Reporting, Prince, the capital city. A hurried male voice interrupted the passionate passion in the room. Standing at the door, Feng Xiao only had one word in his mind. It's over. He had actually disturbed the prince and Wang Fei's intimate moment. Most importantly, damn it, if you want to be intimate, can't you go inside? Even if there was a screen, it would be good. And Mo Xiao, do you need to be so thirsty? Wang Fei is pregnant, you beast. When Feng Xiao was standing at the door imagining all kinds of things, he forgot to look at Mo Xiao's dark expression. Yili looked at Mo Xiao staring at Feng Xiao and felt a chill. She helplessly pulled on his sleeve and shook it. Even though it was a bit shocking for someone to see this, but Yili was not a woman born in this era. What kind of things had she not seen in her previous life? They were just being caught kissing, they were still husband and wife. So, Yili felt a bit uncomfortable and then passed. But Feng Xiao, who was standing at the door, looked at his strange and conflicted expression and knew that he was overthinking things. Giving a light cough, Yili reminded him in a quiet voice, Feng San, come in and talk. Feng Xiao suddenly came back to his senses. When he saw Mo Xiao's dangerous and dark gaze, he wanted to punch himself. After spoiling the prince's happy moment, he didn't run away and was standing here in a daze. He, Feng Xiao, was really becoming worse and worse. He looked pitifully at Mo Xiao with a sad face. Mo Xiao gave a cold snort and allowed it. Feng Xiao happily thanked Yili and then walked in. However, he still carefully chose a spot closest to the door so that if something happened, he could escape at the first moment. Mo Xiao and Yili naturally saw his behavior. Yili covered her mouth and snickered. Mo Xiao raised his eyebrows and ignored him. What's going on in the capital? Speaking of business, Feng Xiao immediately returned to normal and said respectfully, there's news from the capital. Mo Jingqi sent 2 princes, Elder Su, and a few other important court officials to the northwest. They'll probably arrive in a few days. Mo Xiao raised his eyebrows. Sending important officials to the northwest? What for? Feng Xiao rubbed his chin and smiled. What else? They're probably here to persuade the prince. The 200,000 De Chu state troops stationed outside Fei Hong Pass were easily driven back into the pass by us. At the time, Mo Jingqi was so angry that he issued several edicts to scold the prince. It's been so long, it's time for him to come back to his senses. Mo Jingqi was not really an idiot. As long as the Prince Ding mansion did not say the opposite, he naturally would not meet the Prince Ding mansion on the battlefield at this time. He had not finished dealing with Xiling and the northern tribes. If the Prince Ding mansion came out to mess things up now, the court would be in danger. He was also certain that Mo Xiao would not easily fall out with the court, so he thought of doing this to let the world see his generosity. What he did not understand was that he was not the only one who needed time. The Mahist army in the northwest also needed time. Who are those people? Mo Xiao asked. Feng Xiao said it's De Wang Mo Xiafei, Yuang Mo Jingyu and Su Zhe, as well as the Assistant Minister of Appointments Mo Jian. Mo Xiao nodded. Without mentioning Su Zhe and Mo Jingqi, De Wang Mo Xiafei was the previous emperor's second brother. Mo Jingqi also had to respectfully address him as imperial uncle. Yuang Mo Jingyu was Mo Jingqi's half-brother. He usually kept a low profile and did not like to pay attention to worldly affairs. It was unknown why Mo Jingqi had sent him. The two princes were important officials. Mo Jingqi had sent an envoy with great sincerity this time. Unfortunately, Mo Xiuyao did not plan to give him too much face. Yili frowned and said, "The northwest is far away from the capital. Why would Mo Jingqi send Elder Su?" Su Zhe was already over 70 years old, and his health had not been good these past few years. Logically speaking, this kind of task should not be sent to such an old official. If something happened on the way, it would not be good. Feng Jiao thought for a moment and said, "Could it be that Mo Jingqi knows that Su Zuidi is still alive, so he sent Elder Su?" Mo Xiuyao said, "It's been half a year. Mo Jingqi should have heard the news. Even if he did not know before, he should know now. Su Zuidi. If Su Zuidi could actually arouse Mo Jingqi's interest, then..." Mo Xiuyao's face darkened, the coldness in his eyes becoming even more frightening. "What does the prince plan to do with these people?" Feng Jiao asked. He did not have any feelings for the two princes, but Su Zhe and Mo Jian were rare upright officials in the court. Moreover, Su Zhe could be considered Mo Xiuyao's half-teacher. Mo Xiuyao had always respected him. Mo Xiuyao waved his hand and said, "Don't worry about it. I ask you to draft the list of appointed officials in the Northwest. Have you finished drafting it?" Chapter 419. Feng Jiao took out a booklet and handed it over. Mo Xiuyao casually flipped through it and handed it to Yili beside him. He said, "That's pretty much it. The news should be announced after Mo Jingqi's people arrive. Previously, you said that the people of the city wanted to hold a lantern festival to pray for Wang Fei and Shizhi.
Set it on the same day.
When the time comes, the officials of the city will celebrate with the people. It can also be considered welcoming the emissary from the court. Also, has the new fu been built? It's not a good idea for us to always occupy the governor's fu. When the new governor takes office, we can't let him work in a civilian residence, right?" Feng Jiao agreed. Mo Xiuyao's actions were clearly provoking the emissary sent by Mo Jingqi, but he liked it. He smiled as he said, "The fu has been prepared long ago. It was originally the fu of the richest man in Riyang City. That person fled to the pass with the garrison. This subordinate ordered people to reconstruct the two courtyards on the left and right side of the fu. Although it is not as grand as the Wang Fu in Jing City, it is still barely livable. That fu is now in the southeast of the city center. However, according to the new plan of Riyang City, after the reconstruction, the fu will be in the center of Riyang City." Naturally, there were people who had already taken care of these trivial matters. However, the prince was in a bad mood and did not mention moving, so the subordinates did not dare to say anything. This led to the present situation. The officials who were temporarily in charge of the affairs of the city still worked in the yamen in front of the governor's fu. However, after they finished their work, they had to take all the documents back to their temporary residence. It was fine during normal times, but if it was winter or rainy, it was very troublesome to run back and forth. "Very good." Mo Xiuyao nodded in satisfaction and said, "Have people quickly tidy up the place." Feng Jiao said with a smile, "It has been prepared long ago. Prince and Wang Fei can move in at any time. However, please have Prince inscribe the words on the board of the fu." Originally, this matter did not need to be too difficult, but now that Mo Xiuyao's title had been taken by Mo Jingqi, no one could decide what words to inscribe on the new fu. Therefore, it was better to ask Prince to do the questions himself. Mo Xiuyao didn't care at all. He said calmly, "Let's go with the Prince Ding mansion." Feng Jiao stared blankly for a moment. It wasn't the imperial residence in the capital, but the three simple words, Prince Ding Mansion. Seeing Mo Xiuyao's nonchalant attitude, it was clear that he did not care about the fact that Mo Jingqi had stolen his title. He could not help but smile and said, "This subordinate obeys." Because of Yili's return, although there was no big movement in Riyang City, everyone could feel that something was different. The common people in the city busied themselves with their lives. The soldiers stationed in the city seemed to have shaken off their previous gloominess like their masters. They appeared to be full of vitality. The entire city was thriving. Yili's courtyard was still unusually quiet and comfortable. The second day after Su Qingze returned to the city, he had been caught by Feng Jiao to work. Su Qingfeng and Su Qingyan did not have anything to do. Every day, Su Qingyan would drag Su Qingfeng to Yi Li's courtyard. If they were not chatting, they were playing chess. Their days were leisurely and comfortable. Every time Mo Xiaoyao saw this, he wanted to kick him out of Riyang City. However, with Yi Li's words of love that day, Mo Xiaoyao's mood clearly improved greatly. However, every time he saw Su Qingyan, he couldn't help but frown. On the chessboard, the black and white pieces were fighting fiercely. Somewhere outside the courtyard, there was also an endless battle going on. Su Qingyan gripped a piece and said with a frown, "Li Jijia, is this fu really suitable for nurturing a fetus? They come here every few days." After living here for a few days, Su Qingyan was already used to the occasional assassination attempts in the fu. Anyone who saw this every day would get used to it. Su Qingyan could only admire the patience of these assassins. They fought and lost, but they kept fighting. It was just too annoying. Yili leisurely took a sip of the white fungus soup that a servant girl beside her had delivered. She smiled faintly and said, "No matter. This fu is just too boring. It's good to be lively once in a while." Su Qingyan deeply agreed. Mo Xiaoyao was afraid that other people would disturb Yi Li's rest. Other than Qin Feng, Zhu Jing, and Xin Yang and Dr. Lin who treated Yi Li, normal people in the fu could not get close to Wang Fei's courtyard. If something happened in the fu, it was directly reported to Mo Xiaoyao. No one dared to use these trivial matters to bother Yi Li. This was originally with good intentions, but this way, Yi Li was bored. She snorted softly and said, "Prince Ding is really petty. What's wrong with Li Jiejie going out for a walk? It's as if he's afraid that other people will take a second look. Li Jiejie is so outstanding that everyone in the world admires her." Speaking of this, Su Qingyan couldn't help but feel proud. There were many beautiful women in the world, but whose sister could lead tens of thousands of soldiers to fight against a strong enemy. Only his, Su Qingyan's sister. In the future, he would definitely marry a woman as strong as Li Jiejie. Yi Li raised a hand and knocked Su Qingyan on the head. She glanced at him and said, "Call me brother-in-law. Do you think Mo Xiaoyao hasn't tormented you enough?" Su Qingyan was suddenly depressed. These past few days, he had fought with Mo Xiaoyao. For the time being, he couldn't fight against Mo Xiaoyao, that treacherous villain. Although Mo Xiaoyao would let him win in front of Li Jiejie, behind his back, Su Qingyan would think of ways to trip him up and use underhanded methods. Yesterday, he even slandered Li Jiejie, saying that he had taken a fancy to a beautiful girl in the city and wanted Li Jiejie to write a letter to his parents to arrange a marriage for him. If this really reached his father's ears, wouldn't he be skinned alive? His older brothers hadn't even gotten married yet. He, the youngest one, had taken a fancy to another family's girl. Liking beauty was his crime. Li Jiejie knows about it. Su Qingyan was dejected. He couldn't fight against Mo Xiaoyao. Now that Li Jiejie knew about it, he felt that he had lost face. Su Qingfeng, who was watching from the side, sneered. He raised his hand and knocked on Su Qingyan's head. "Second brother, third brother already told you not to provoke Prince. You just wouldn't listen." Su Qingyan glared at him. "He's clearly the one who's targeting me." Su Qingfeng raised his eyebrows. "Then why isn't Prince targeting your second brother and me? So, isn't this what you asked for?" Su Qingyan laid on the table and sighed. "Third brother, I'm your younger brother." He really missed fourth brother. If fourth brother was here, he would definitely help him fight against Mo Xiaoyao. Listening to Su Qingyan's chatter, Yi Li smiled and put down a chess piece. She asked, "That's right. Has third brother been bored in the fu these past few days?" Su Qingyan was still a child. He could find fun anywhere. Su Qingfeng, as a grown man, didn't go anywhere in the fu. It was indeed a bit difficult for him. Su Qingfeng smiled and said, "It's a bit boring compared to the army, but it's fine. Once you give birth to the child, I should return to the capital. Third brother and second brother aren't in the capital, so father and mother will be worried. When this was brought up, Yili frowned and said, speaking of which, second brother is in the northwest now. Does the emperor in the capital make things difficult for second uncle? There's also Zheng Er. Her wedding with second brother was set for last year, but now, Su Qingfeng comforted her, it's fine. If the emperor wants to make things difficult for our Su family, he can find a reason. He won't make things difficult for father because of this. Moreover, father also said that he doesn't want second brother to go back now. I don't know what the current situation in the capital is like. Second brother isn't someone like fourth brother. If he gets involved, it'll be hard for him to extricate himself. As for young Miss Qin, Chapter 420. Su Qingfeng helplessly scratched his head. Right now, he could only rejoice that he hadn't had time to get engaged. Otherwise, wouldn't he be delaying the girl's future? If there were any accidents in the future, he was afraid that his wife's family would be implicated. Right now, our Su family isn't having a good time. It's actually a good thing that the Qin family's young miss hasn't married into our family yet. I heard that second brother had someone bring a letter back to our parents. If there's a good family, we'll ask the Qin family's young miss to marry on her own. Yili frowned. She had a very good relationship with Qin Zheng. How could she not see that Qin Zheng was deeply in love with her second brother? Moreover, the two had been engaged since they were young. For more than 10 years, Qin Zheng's thoughts had only been on her second brother. Now, asking her to marry on her own was a bit. Although she knew that second brother was doing this for Qin Zheng's sake, she still felt that he deserved a beating. On the other hand, Yili also felt a bit apologetic towards Qin Zheng. In the end, wasn't it all because of her that second brother had followed the army to the northwest and was now stuck in the northwest? Su Qingyan looked at Yili and said with a grin, "Sisterly, this isn't your fault. With our family's current situation, it's better if we don't implicate more people. Who knows when the palace will execute the entire family? At that time, not only will the Qin family's sister be implicated, even the Qin family will be implicated." Su Qingfeng frowned and patted Su Qingyan. "You brat, you really shoot your mouth off." Su Qingyan made a face. The only advantage of being in the northwest, especially in this fu, was that they could speak without worry. They didn't have to worry about the walls having ears. Yili lowered her head to look at her increasingly difficult figure and sighed. "There's nothing we can do now. Later, third brother, please write a letter to aunt to inquire about the Qin family. Since third brother feels bored, why don't you go to the military camp outside the city for a while?" Su Qingfeng's eyes immediately lit up. Even Su Qingyan's face had an excited and curious expression. The Maoist army was the elite army of Dechu State. Su Qingfeng had naturally admired it for a long time. However, due to her special status, it wasn't appropriate for her to go to the military camp to prevent outsiders from gossiping about Yili. Hesitantly, he asked, "Isn't this against the rules?" Yili smiled faintly. "What's there to worry about? It's not like we're asking third brother to lead an army to war." Su Qingfeng nodded and said with a smile, "Li is right. If I can join the Maoist army, I don't mind being a pawn. I don't think others know who I am." When Qingfeng heard this, he looked at Su Qingfeng and said with a smile, "If third young Master Su is willing to suffer, you might as well come to my place." After all, there were many people in the Maoist army camp, and Qilin was directly under the princess consort, so it was naturally more convenient. Su Qingyan blinked. "Big brother Qin, can I go?" Qingfeng looked at him and shook his head, saying, "Fifth young master probably won't last a day." Su Qingyan wasn't convinced. He glared and said, "Why can third brother but I can't? You look down on my young age, but I'll do it for you." Qingfeng shook his head and said with a smile, "It's not that I look down on your young age. Right now, I have two people even younger than fifth young master. However, fifth young master has been pampered since childhood and doesn't practice martial arts. That's why I said fifth young master can't stand it." Yili smiled and looked at Qingfeng, saying, "Can third brother go to your place?" Qingfeng said, "But Wang Fei only needs to say one word. Third young master can go, at any time." Yili waved her hand and said, The prince and I have handed Qi Lin to you, so you have the final say. Although Qin Feng didn't show it on his face, in his heart, he was very grateful for Yi Li's trust. He looked at Su Qingfeng and said, "In that case, third young master should report outside the city tomorrow morning. But I'll say this first. When the time comes, I won't be merciful. If third young master can't stand it, I'll have to send you back." Su Qingfeng had also heard of Qi Lin's mysteriousness and fame. He was also eager to give it a try. He laughed loudly and said, "In that case, Commander Qin doesn't need to call me third young master. You can call me by my name." After saying this, Yi Li asked, "Why are you here at this time?" Qin Feng nodded and handed over a sealed file, saying, "Although the prince doesn't want to disturb Wang Fei's rest, this subordinate still wants Wang Fei to take a look. This is the training plan for next month. I hope Wang Fei can give me some pointers." For the past few months, Qin Feng had been in charge of Qi Lin's training alone. Occasionally, he would discuss it with Zhu Jing, Lin Han, and the others. Qi Lin's starting point was too high. Thus, Qin Feng had always been a little nervous. Now that Yi Li was back, he naturally couldn't help but want Yi Li to take a look. Even if he didn't praise her, he could at least let her know if there were any problems with his training. Yi Li put the file to one side and said with a smile, "I'll take a look at it later. You can do it according to your own ideas. I'll teach you most of what I can teach you. In another 3 months, I should be able to take action. Your subordinates should also be done with their training. When the time comes, I'll personally go and see them." Qin Feng was overjoyed and said with a smile, "Thank you, Wang Fei. This subordinate understands." He immediately decided that when the time came, he would ask Wang Fei to personally design the final assessment for the group of youngsters. Last year, the final assessment for the first batch couldn't be carried out because of an unexpected incident. Qin Feng had always felt deeply regretful. This time, even the elders had recovered. "That's right, Wang Fei. When this subordinate came over, I saw the Shadow Guard catch a few more assassins." Qin Feng remembered what he had seen when he came over and said casually. Yi Li smiled and said, "The Shadow Guard should be overcrowded these days, right? Catching assassins every day and keeping them alive." She didn't know what Mo Xiaoyao was planning to do with these people. Qin Feng said with a smile, "Isn't that so? This morning, I saw Mo Hua's expression was very ugly. He even said that he wanted to borrow our prison cell to lock people up." Yi Li thought for a moment and said, "No matter what, don't lock those assassins up with Su Zuidi. Tell Mo Hua that those who aren't that important shouldn't stay with him." Qin Feng nodded and said, "This subordinate also said the same thing. But the prince didn't allow them to be killed. He said it would be useful." Yi Li nodded, "Let's do whatever the prince says." "What's wrong with eyes?" Mo Xiaoyao was dressed in a green robe. His hair was as white as snow. He stood under the moon gate and asked everyone with a smile. Yi Li's body wasn't well, and she was too lazy to get up. She smiled and asked, "Why did you come back? Be careful that Feng Sen comes over to complain." Everyone stood up and saluted him. Mo Xiaoyao casually waved his hand and walked over to Yi Li to sit down. He said with a bit of displeasure, "Mo Jingqi's people have arrived. They're preparing to go and greet them. Otherwise, how could I come back so leisurely?" Yi Li sat up straight. "De Wang and the others have arrived? Prince isn't going to greet them?" Mo Xiaoyao curled his lips. "I don't have that kind of skill." Feng Sen went. Yi Li couldn't help but twitch the corner of her mouth. "You might as well have sent Feng Sen over to greet them." Although Feng Xiao was Mo Xiaoyao's most trusted aide, Feng Xiao was unwilling to accept the imperial court's rewards. Perhaps it was because of his strange temperament or some other reason. Thus, until now, Feng Xiao was still a virgin. Moreover, he was in charge of many things, so everyone addressed him casually. On the battlefield, they called him General Feng. The officials in Ruyang City called him Lord Feng. Mo Xiaoyao's trusted aides called him Young Master Feng San. In reality, Feng Xiao himself didn't even have the lowest rank of official. It was said that De Wang was a person who cared the most about ostentation and face. If he sent Feng Xiao, he would definitely be angered. Chapter 421. It was Feng San who wanted to go. Mo Shuyao said. He didn't plan on sending people to the city gates to welcome them. It was already good enough that they could enter the city. Yi Li was silent. So Feng Jiao was afraid that you would anger them to death, so he decided to go and anger them half to death himself? Mo Shuyao leaned against Yi Li and sat down lazily. He smiled and said, Li doesn't need to worry about these trivial matters. How could I not know what De Wang and the others want to say? I'm just too lazy to pay attention to them. Yi Li helplessly pushed him to sit upright. Tonight's welcoming banquet still has to be held, right? Prince, don't tell me that you're even skipping this. If word gets out, people will think that we don't know how to treat guests. Mo Shuyao frowned and sighed. Without Uncle Mo, it's really quite troublesome. If it was in the past, Uncle Mo would have directly taken care of these small matters and only needed to report to them. But now, most of the Prince Ding Mansion's power had been transferred to the northwest, so Uncle Mo couldn't immediately come over. Otherwise, it would be troublesome if there was no one to manage the internal affairs. It's a pity that Feng San isn't willing to be the steward. Yi Li glanced at him. Letting Feng Xiao be the steward was truly worthy of being Prince Ding's idea. Shaking her head, Yi Li said, Forget it, I'll have Wei Lin and Lin Han do it later. If the dignified Prince Ding Mansion couldn't find someone who could be the steward, wouldn't it be a joke if word got out? Mo Shuyao nodded in satisfaction and smiled. Zhuo Jing and the others by Li Li's side are all capable. One of them can definitely take Uncle Mo's place first. Yi Li thought about how Zhuo Jing and the others were like Uncle Mo, worrying about all kinds of things in the prince's residence all day long, and couldn't help but shiver. The three of them had been with her for a long time. As their master, she couldn't be too disloyal. They're too young. Let's bring up a trustworthy steward later. Mo Shuyao shrugged his shoulders regretfully, in agreement. At the city gate of Riyang City, Feng Xiao stood with a smile on his face. He was accompanied by a few officials who were in charge of the affairs of the city, as well as many commoners who were watching the bustling scene. The officials of Riyang City were all dressed in casual clothes, which made young Master Feng San look even more charming in his red robe. Compared to the casual appearance of the host, the other party's men and horses were all dressed in official robes, which made them seem especially grand and strange. Feng Xiao held his fan and leaned against the city wall. He asked casually, It's such a hot day. Don't they feel hot wearing so much? That was why he said what was so good about being an official. On such a hot day, they had to wear so many layers of clothing. Weren't they afraid of getting sick from the heat? The Chu state was known as the state of etiquette. Even in summer, there were 4 or 5 layers of court robes. Moreover, the court robes weren't made of soft and breathable gauze. Instead, they were made to show the majesty of the imperial family. The court robes were usually made of heavy and gorgeous cloud brocade. One could tell how hot it was just by looking at how sweaty the guards were. No one answered his question because the procession in front of him had already reached the city gate. The commoners of Riyang City were very curious. The northwest was remote. If there wasn't anything going on, they wouldn't see a true high-ranking official or noble person for decades. The most important person the commoners could see was the governor of the city. Currently, Prince Ding lived in Riyang City. Now, 2 more princes and several other high-ranking officials had arrived. The commoners naturally flocked to the city gate to see the heat, to welcome the imperial envoy. Hundreds of guards escorted the long procession to the city gate. A slightly stout old man stepped out of the first red sandalwood carriage. He wore a dark purple robe with an embroidered pattern. His hair and beard were white, but his expression was arrogant. He seemed to look down on all living things. He stepped on a guard's blanket and landed. He glanced at the people standing at the city gate. His expression immediately darkened. Feng Xiao acted as if he did not see his expression. With a smile on his face, he went forward and cupped his hands in greeting. Feng San of Ding Wangfu has come under Wang Ye's orders to welcome the 2 Wang Ye and Darren. Feng San greets De Wang. Feng San, Feng Xiao? Prince De looked at Feng Xiao with a dark expression. Prince De had naturally heard of Feng Xiao's reputation. Normally, he wouldn't mind giving some face to the younger generation. However, Mo Xiaoyao had sent a commoner with an official position to welcome them. This was a slap to his face. Prince Da was so old that even the emperor had to show him some respect. How could he tolerate this? Feng Zhiao smiled. It really is me. Your Highness Prince Da has a good memory. Prince Da coldly said, whereas Mo Xiaoyao. Although Prince Da was old, he was of the same generation as Mo Xiaoyao. In addition to the status of the Prince Ding mansion, Prince Da had to address him as Prince Ding. However, since Mo Xiaoyao didn't give him face, he naturally didn't plan on giving face to Mo Xiaoyao either. He didn't hold back and directly called him by his name. Feng Zhiao didn't get angry. He smiled and said, Wang Fei is pregnant. Prince Da is worried about Wang Fei and little Shitzi. Thus, he didn't have time to welcome Prince Da. Please forgive me, Prince. Prince Da's face alternated between green and white. Feng Zhiao spoke tactfully, but the meaning behind his words was very clear. Prince Ding Da is busy with Wang Fei and doesn't have time to welcome you. Impudence. His Majesty has already taken away Mo Xiaoyao's title. How dare you call him Prince Da? Prince Da angrily rebuked. Feng Zhiao slightly lowered his eyes. The officials standing behind him were all trusted aides of the Prince Ding mansion. How could they tolerate Prince Da's rudeness? Just as he was about to step forward to argue, Prince Yu in the carriage behind him caught up. He hurriedly pulled Prince Da to smooth things over. Imperial uncle, what's wrong? It wasn't easy for us to travel thousands of miles to Ruyang. Why are we standing at the city gates and getting angry?
Oh,
is this young Master Feng-san? Feng Zhiao was famous in the capital in the past, so Mo Jingyu naturally recognized him. Feng Zhiao smiled and cupped his hands. Feng-san greets King Yu, Lord Su, and Lord Mo Su Zhe was the oldest. After a long journey, his aged face was filled with exhaustion and paleness. However, he still nodded at Feng Zhiao. Feng Zhiao looked at Su Zhe and inwardly sighed. He opened the city gates and invited the group into the city. When he was young, he followed by Mo Xiaoyao's side and received much of Su Zhe's teachings. When he thought about Su Zuodi, who was still locked up in the dungeon, he couldn't help but inwardly sigh. The prince and his majesty must be tired from the long journey. Please enter the city and rest for a while. Later, the prince and his majesty will hold a welcoming dinner for you. Prince Da glanced at the surrounding officials and commoners who were staring at him with unkind expressions. He knew that if he continued to cause trouble here, he would be the only one who would be embarrassed. With a snort, he flung his sleeves and walked into the city. Mo Jingyu looked around and followed with a smile. In his heart, he sighed that Mo Xiaoyao had only been in Ruyang for half a year, yet he was able to make the commoners and officials in the city side with him wholeheartedly. The power and influence of Prince Ding's residence on the commoners was indeed unfathomable. Prince Da's personality was that of a hot-tempered old man. After being angered by Feng Zhiao at the city gates, he naturally couldn't vent his anger on Mo Xiaoyao at the welcoming dinner tonight. After entering the city, he didn't bother with the inn that Feng Zhiao had arranged for him to stay in and headed straight for the governor's manor. In reality, he didn't understand that Mo Xiaoyao hadn't planned on sending anyone to welcome him. If Feng Zhiao hadn't brought anyone with him, and he arrived at the city gates with such a large entourage only to find no one there, it would have been even worse. When he arrived at the governor's manor, he was informed that the prince and his majesty had just moved to a new residence. From now on, the governor's manor would be the Ruyang governor's manor. Thus, in a fit of anger, Prince Da brought his men to the Prince Ding mansion in the southeast of Ruyang City. This trip to the northwest had originally been led by Prince Da. He couldn't rest and insisted on finding Mo Xiaoyao. The others naturally couldn't rest and could only follow along. Chapter 422. The Prince Ding mansion was located in the southeast of Ruyang City on the main road of the city, Xuanwu Street. Naturally, It couldn't compare to the Chu capital's Prince Ding mansion in terms of size and grandeur, but after a few months of renovations, it was still quite large. After all, the Chu capital's prosperity had a bit more of the Northwest's simplicity and boldness, adding a bit of austere air. On the main door, there were 3 simple words, Ding Wang Fu. It was majestic and imposing. Da Wang was so angry that his fingers trembled. Impudent. Too impudent. What does Mo Xiuyao want to do? The people around him were silent. Da Wang only wanted to vent his anger and didn't really want an answer. Mo Jingyu stood to the side as though it had nothing to do with him, leisurely admiring the scenery. Not long after, someone came out to invite them in. At the same time, Da Wang's expression became even uglier. It was fine that Mo Xiuyao didn't come out of the city to welcome them, but he didn't even come out of the mansion's entrance. The other 3 people behind him also had ugly expressions, but it wasn't because of their face. Rather, it was because Prince Ding's actions showed that he didn't plan on giving the imperial court any face. This way, it would be difficult for them to complete their task this time. Mo Jingyu directly cursed Mo Jingqi in his heart. He was originally an idle prince. Whoever became the emperor had nothing to do with him. Mo Jingqi himself had ruined the relationship with the Prince Ding mansion, and now he had to travel thousands of li to the northwest. If Mo Xiuyao really had the intention to rebel, would they still be alive to return to the capital? Wei Lin led the group into the mansion with a wooden expression. His overly young face made him look like he wasn't a manager who could manage a mansion's affairs. Of course, in reality, he wasn't. It was just that he didn't hide as quickly as Zhu Jing and Lin Han, so the prince made him a temporary manager. Looking sideways at Feng Zhiyao, who was leisurely following at the side, Wei Lin silently agreed with his opinion. The position of general manager sounded very prestigious, but it was really not suitable for young people like them in their prime. Hearing someone call him Steward Wei, Wei Lin felt a slight stomachache. In the hall, Mo Xiuyao was sitting and talking to Yu Li. When he saw Wei Lin leading his men in, he did not hold back and said with a faint smile, Da Wang, King Yu, Lord Su, Lord Mo, please take a seat. Seeing Mo Xiuyao's white hair casually tied up and the smile on his face, he looked much warmer than when he was in the capital, but he didn't give off the slightest sense of closeness. On the contrary, it was even more frightening. Previously, Mo Xiuyao had kept it a secret, so even though Mo Jingqi had tried to plant many spies in Riyang, no one in the Chu capital knew that Mo Xiuyao's hair had turned white overnight. Now that he saw it all of a sudden, he was shocked. King Dis slanted his eyes and snorted coldly, "You've been away from the capital for a while. Have you forgotten your manners? It seems that the emperor was right when he said that you were arrogant." Mo Xiuyao looked playfully at the furious King Da in front of him. Manners? Did he want him to salute him? In King Da's opinion, Mo Xiuyao was just a commoner whose title had been taken away by the emperor. Logically speaking, he should be saluting him. But unfortunately, from the moment King Da entered Riyang City, he was destined to be stifled. Arrogant? Why does this prince remember that His Majesty was talking about treason and rebellion? Feng San? Mo Xiuyao's words carried a smile, but his eyes revealed traces of coldness. Feng Zhiao waved his fan and smiled, replying to Prince, "His Majesty's imperial edict did say so. How dare you, Mo Xiuyao? You." King Da flew into a rage after being reprimanded by the 2 of them. A crisp sound strangely drowned out King Da's angry roar. Everyone looked towards the source of the sound. The white jade teacup in Mo Xiuyao's hand instantly shattered. A few pieces of jade fell to the ground with a crisp sound. Mo Xiuyao slowly opened his hand. The white powder fell from his palm and floated to the ground in front of him. King Da's throat seemed to be blocked by something. He opened his mouth but couldn't say a single word. He only heard Mo Xiuyao say with a smile, "King Da, lower your voice. If you scare I's beloved concubine and heir, it will really make things difficult for I." King Da's heart couldn't help but tremble when he met Mo Xiuyao's cold eyes. He didn't know why, but he remembered the 7,000 soldiers that Mo Xiuyao had killed. After staring blankly for a while, King Da didn't dare to say anything. His face, which had been well maintained, kept changing between green and red. Jingyu looked at everyone in the hall and said with a smile, Imperial Uncle has come a long way, so it's inevitable that he's a bit angry. I hope Prince Ding will forgive him. Mo Xiaoyao glanced at him and said with a faint smile, so that's how it is. Then there's no need to worry. The weather is hot, so it's hard not to get angry. The Northwest isn't as prosperous as the capital. I will order people to prepare more food for King De to cool down his anger. Mo Jingyu's smile was a bit stiff, but he still had to say what he had to say. He could tell that if he let the bad-tempered imperial uncle say something, he might anger Mo Xiaoyao and the others. If that happened, none of them would be able to return alive. The Northwest is bitterly cold. It's cold in the winter and hot in the summer. It's very remote. Prince Ding has been away for a long time. Now that the Northwest has been pacified, why don't you return to the capital as soon as possible? That way, the princess consort and heir won't have to suffer here. Return to the capital? Mo Xiaoyao seemed to have heard something interesting. He raised his brows and looked at Mo Jingyu. After not seeing him for a long time, the idle prince Mo Jingyu's ability to lie through his teeth had improved quite a bit. Mo Jingqi had already issued an edict to strip him of his title and reduce his military power. Furthermore, he had announced that he was planning to commit treason. Now, Mo Jingyu was actually telling him that it was time to return to the capital? Was there something wrong with Mo Jingyu's brain, or did he think that there was something wrong with his brain? There was nothing wrong with Mo Jingyu's brain. It was the people above him who had problems with their brains. Trying his best to maintain the smile on his face, Mo Jingyu cursed Mo Jingqi countless times in his heart. Not to mention that Mo Xiaoyao finally couldn't tolerate him anymore, not to mention that his own younger brother had rebelled against him. If this continued, he would also want to rebel. Glancing at Suja sitting across from him, Mo Jingyu hoped that Mo Xiaoyao would give this old man some face. After all, Suja could be considered Mo Xiaoyao's half-teacher. Furthermore, Mo Xiaoyao had always been respectful towards this old man. Suja looked at Mo Xiaoyao's head of white hair and sighed heavily in his heart. It could be said that these old men had seen with their own eyes how Mo Xiaoyao had gone from being a high-spirited and dazzling young man to where he was today. Mo Xiaoyao was once his proudest student, as well as his future grandson-in-law whom he had high hopes for. However, in these 10 years, he had watched him struggle to move forward step by step. He had been powerless. Whether this matter was Mo Xiaoyao's fault, Suja didn't know. The core of the Su family was already too far away. However, there was one thing that Suja was well aware of. Mo Xiaoyao definitely couldn't return to the capital now. Thus, when he sensed Mo Jingyu's gaze on him, Suja only lowered his eyes and calmly drank his tea, as though he didn't know anything.
Suja refused to speak.
Mo Jian's words carried little weight, so he naturally couldn't speak. Mo Jingyu was inwardly furious, but there was nothing he could do. The atmosphere in the hall was heavy. Yili's calm gaze swept over everyone. She softly said, "You've all come from afar, so you must be tired. Why don't you rest and freshen up first? If there's anything else, we can discuss it at night." Chapter 423. Mo Jingyu, who was caught between a rock and a hard place, naturally couldn't ask for anything better. He hurriedly smiled and said, "Princess Consort is right. It was this prince who was rude." Since Yili had spoken, Mo Xiaoyao naturally had nothing to say. He looked at Yili with concern and asked, "Are you tired? I'll send you back to rest." After speaking, he ignored the guests still sitting in the hall and supported Yili to stand up. He told Feng Zhiyao and Wei Lin to take care of the guests, then left with Yili, seeing Mo Xiaoyao and Yili disappear at the door. Prince De finally calmed down. He pointed at the door and gasped for breath. What kind of attitude is that? Mo Jingyu smiled bitterly. He pressed down on Prince De and advised, "This is the first time Princess Ding is pregnant, and she just returned from a calamity. It's inevitable that Prince Ding is nervous. Imperial uncle, why get angry?" Prince De humphed. He picked up the teacup beside him and took a big gulp to suppress his anger. At the side, Feng Jiao raised his brows and smiled. Princes, our prince originally lived in the governor's manor, so we arranged for him to stay in an inn. Now that the prince and princess consort have moved to a new manor, I ask the prince and the two sirs to rest in the manor. Prince Da rolled his eyes at him. Of course, he couldn't stay in an inn. As the emperor's uncle and also an imperial envoy, if he was thrown to stay in an inn, wouldn't he be laughed at when he returned to the capital? Wei Lin expressionlessly glanced at the crowd. He turned and ordered people to arrange accommodations. At night, the entire Ryong city was brightly lit. Unlike the welcoming banquet earlier, which only had a few people, the welcoming banquet was exceptionally grand. The welcoming banquet was held on the tower of Ryong City's East Gate. Looking down from the top, Xuanwu Street was filled with people. Both sides of the street were decorated with lanterns and colored banners. It was extraordinarily lively. The tower was also filled with toasts, singing, and dancing. All the civil officials and military officers in or near Ryong City, as well as the local famous people of Ryong City, were present at tonight's banquet. Although Prince Ding had already been in Ryong City for half a year, only a very small number of people in the city had actually seen Prince Ding. As for Princess Ding, it could be said that she had never shown her face outside. Therefore, when they saw Prince Ding, who was dressed in a white robe with silver dragons embroidered on the edges, and whose hair was as white as snow, holding the hand of a woman in green who was pregnant and had a graceful bearing and elegant appearance, everyone could not help but be stunned. The two figures, one white and one green, stood side by side. They looked extremely harmonious and natural, as if they were born to be like this. Mo Xiaoyao helped Yili up the stage and carefully helped her sit down. Many of the soldiers seated below had not seen Mo Xiaoyao for a long time. The soldiers who had followed Yili before were especially excited and shouted in unison, "This subordinate greets Prince Wang Fei." Receiving their call, the civil officials on the other side also stood and bowed. "This subordinate greets Prince Wang Fei." Congratulations to Prince Wang Fei for having a little heir. Even though he did not like the little thing that had come to stay in Li's stomach and refused to come out, Mo Xiaoyao was in a good mood right now. He waved his hand and said, "Everyone rise." At the same time, the noise from the tower also affected the people playing below. The people who had been playing below the tower turned and knelt in the direction of the tower. Someone took the lead and shouted, "Congratulations to Prince Wang Fei for 1,000 years of good health. Congratulations to Wang Fei for a safe return." With someone taking the lead, the people behind them naturally shouted as well. For a moment, their voices seemed to penetrate the entire Ryong city. Mo Xiaoyao picked up a cup of wine and stood up. He looked at the people below the city and raised his voice. No need for formalities. Tonight, the officials and the people will enjoy together. Here's a toast to all of you. His voice, which was infused with internal energy, spread far and wide. The people below the city stood up and cheered in unison. The atmosphere became even more lively than before. On the city tower, everyone stood up and raised their wine cups. "Thank you, Prince Wang Fei." After drinking a cup, Mo Xiaoyao sat down and said, "Everyone, feel free. There's no need to be restrained." The song and dance started again. The city tower was filled with joy and harmony. Only De Wang and Yu Wang, who were sitting in front of the guests, had ugly expressions on their faces. The two of them had never thought that Mo Xiaoyao would be able to make all of the officials and people in Ryong City love and submit to him so much in just half a year when the imperial court was doing its best to destroy Prince Ding's reputation. Although it was called a welcoming banquet, it was better to say that Mo Xiaoyao wanted to give them and the imperial court a resounding slap in the face. "What's wrong with De Wang? I see that De Wang's complexion is not good. Where did he neglect you?" Sitting on the main seat, Mo Xiaoyao supported Yili with one hand and held a wine cup with the other. He looked at De Wang, whose face had turned green. De Wang choked. It should be said that ever since he entered Ryong City, where had he not been neglected? Even though tonight's welcoming banquet was lively and joyous, but anyone with eyes could see that the welcoming banquet was just in passing. The true celebration of Ding Wangfei's return and the birth of the future Shixi was the true celebration. De Wang coldly said, "I don't dare." How could I dare to blame Prince Ding for neglecting me? Mo Xiuyao acted as if he did not understand the meaning behind De Wang's words. He laughed loudly and said, "That's good. De Wang has worked hard. Why don't you drink to your heart's content tonight?" Seeing that De Wang's expression was about to change again, Mo Jingyu hurriedly pulled him back and said in a low voice, "Imperial uncle, if there's anything you want to say, let's talk about it later. Don't anger everyone." Then he laughed loudly and said, "Imperial uncle, Prince Ding is right. Uncle has worked hard on this journey. Nephew toasts Imperial uncle." Mo Xiuyao glanced at the two people with different expressions. He smiled faintly and ignored them. He turned to the side and chatted with the generals and officials below. Mo Jingyu used all his strength to suppress De Wang, who was about to explode in anger. He bitterly said in a low voice, "Imperial uncle, calm down. Right now, we're under someone else's roof." De Wang was angry and disdainfully said, "So what? Could it be that he dares to kill I? That's hard to say." Mo Jingyu thought to himself. He said to De Wang in a low voice, "Imperial uncle, right now, the Northwest is Prince Ding's territory. If something happens, no one can do anything to him. Do you still remember the matter with Princess Ding? Mo Xiuyao killed those 7,000 soldiers without even blinking an eye? But what can His Majesty do to him? At most, he could issue a few imperial edicts, reprimanding Mo Xiuyao for his cruelty and indiscriminate killing of the innocent. But what use is that? Would Mo Jingqi dare to send troops to suppress Mo Xiuyao? A few imperial edicts might not even be as effective as paper in the Northwest. De Wang was under Mo Jingqi's paranoid emperor for so many years. He was also highly regarded by the emperor. He definitely wasn't stupid. However, he was the oldest prince of the previous emperor's generation. Even the emperor had to call him imperial uncle. In all these years, he really hadn't met Mo Xiuyao face to face. Subconsciously, he always felt that Mo Xiuyao should respect him a little. Moreover, he was a person who was proud of his status and wanted to keep up appearances, so he was especially agitated when Mo Xiuyao gave him the cold shoulder. Now that he heard Mo Jingyu's advice, he looked at the harmonious scene on the city gate tower. The civil and military officials of Ruyang City clearly obeyed Mo Xiuyao's words. How could they, the emperor's imperial envoys, be in their eyes? A cool breeze blew from the city gate. De Wang's body trembled. His mind instantly cleared up, and he broke out in a cold sweat. Chapter 424. He had lived a peaceful life for more than 10 years. He had long forgotten about the tragic struggle for the throne when the previous emperor had yet to ascend to the throne. It was inevitable that he would become arrogant. At this moment, he suddenly came back to his senses and couldn't help but recall what he had done in the past few years. He even began to suspect that Mo Jingqi had sent him to the Northwest because he didn't like him and wanted to borrow Mo Xiuyao's hands to get rid of him. Mo Jingyu didn't know what he was thinking. He only saw that although his expression was ugly, he had calmed down. Only then did he heave a sigh of relief and raise his wine cup to enjoy the song and dance. Yi Li, who was sitting above, naturally saw the interaction between the King and King Yu. She watched as the King drank his wine with a gloomy face. Although she didn't know what King Yu said, she could tell that he was trying to persuade the King. In his heart, he labeled King Yu as a scheming person. What is Li looking at? Mo Xiuyao lowered his head and looked at Yi Li with a smile. Yi Li shook her head and said with a smile, "It's nothing. You did it on purpose today, didn't you?" If it wasn't for King Yu stopping him, the King would have already gotten angry. Mo Xiuyao snorted and brought a cup of fresh fruit juice to her lips. He said indifferently, "The older the King gets, the less he knows how to be a person. If you don't dry him out first, he can raise his nose to the sky. I have never liked being looked down upon by others." Yi Li took a sip of the fruit juice in her wine cup. The slightly cold watermelon juice had a faint sweetness to it, which suited her appetite. Mo Xiuyao said softly, It's a little cold from the ice, but Mr. Shin said that it won't be a problem if you use it a little. Are you tired? If you're tired, let's go back first. Yili shook her head and said, I'll go back by myself later. Can you leave first? Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head and laughed. Why would we need to stay here for this kind of banquet? I'm afraid they can't wait for us to leave so that they can enjoy themselves. When Yili heard this, she glanced at the people below. It was fine if it was just the civil officials, but even the military generals were sitting obediently, drinking wine, and enjoying the entertainment. Yili had seen these military generals before, and they were never polite when drinking. Sure enough, it was because they were here that they were restrained. She helped Yili up. Everyone below the stage also stopped when they saw the prince and princess consort stand up. They all looked up respectfully. Mo Xiaoyao smiled and said, If I and Wang Fei stay here, you won't be at ease. I will propose another toast to everyone, and then everyone can do as they please. Finishing, he raised the wine cup and proposed a toast to the people below, tilting his head back and draining the contents. Yili stood beside Mo Xiaoyao and similarly raised her wine cup. She smiled faintly and said, This consort would also like to propose a toast to everyone. Please feel free to drink. Everyone gave their thanks in unison, especially the generals who had fought with Yili before. They were very excited. From far away, Yili could see Yunting's young and handsome face turn red as he loudly gave his thanks. Waving his hand for everyone to do as they please, Mo Xiaoyao supported Yili as they left the banquet. Leaving behind the people to continue drinking, it sounded even more lively. Coming down from the city gate tower, Mo Xiaoyao waved away the guards and servant girls. He supported Yili as they strolled down the street. The lights on both sides of the street were bright. The common people had all come out of their homes to play in groups. Zhang Yu, the newly appointed prefect, was very thorough in his work. Not only were there lanterns on the street for people to enjoy, there were also performances to attract people's gazes. If it wasn't for Mo Xiaoyao's head of white hair being too conspicuous, no one would have noticed the two of them walking amidst the happy crowd. Seeing the two of them, the common people were first shocked and then came forward to bow. Mo Xiaoyao hurriedly indicated for everyone not to make a fuss. He held Yili's hand and retreated to a place with fewer people. He helplessly lowered his head to look at the white hair in front of his chest and said, as expected, It's too eye-catching. I can't even accompany you on the street. Yili smiled and said, This also means that you are loved by the common people. The common people rarely see you, so they are naturally very curious. As time passes, they will naturally get used to it. If there were people bowing to them the moment they went out, then they wouldn't need to go out. When they were in the capital, there were high officials and nobles everywhere. If the common people bowed to them as soon as they saw them, there probably wouldn't be enough of them. Mo Xiaoyao looked at Yili and said with a smile, Since we can't enjoy the Lantern Festival, let's slowly walk back. The Prince Ding mansion wasn't too far from here. The two of them held hands and walked slowly along the empty street. Tonight, most of the people in the city had gathered at the Lantern Festival, making the other streets seem especially deserted and quiet. Under the moonlight, the two of them walked side by side. Yili asked softly, King Da and King Yu, what are your plans? Mo Xiaoyao smiled casually and said, These two people won't be able to cause any waves. Let's see what they have to say tomorrow. Does Mo Jingqi think that everyone in the world is a fool? Now he has sent someone to persuade I to return to the capital. Haha. Could it be that Mo Jingqi didn't know that ever since he killed the 7,000 soldiers and occupied Riyang, he would never be able to return? Right now, he was still able to maintain a delicate balance in the Northwest Imperial Court. Once he really returned, what awaited him and the Mahist army was countless impeachment reports and a dead end. Unfortunately, he didn't want to die at all right now. If Mo Jingqi was smart, he shouldn't have provoked him. Mo Jingqi's scheming was nothing in Mo Xiaoyao's eyes. If he thought that the Prince Ding mansion had protected the De Chu state for generations because of the reputation of being a martyr, then he was gravely mistaken. Then what about Lord Su? Yili asked in a low voice. Mo Xiaoyao's respect for Su Zhou was definitely real. Heaven, Earth, king, family, and master, the relationship between a teacher and a student was nothing else. Even when Emo Xiaoyao was betrayed by Su Zuodi under such circumstances, Yili wouldn't believe that it wasn't for Suju's sake. Moreover, Suju's only son and grandson had both died for the sake of the Prince Ding mansion. In Emo Xiaoyao's heart, Suju was no less important than family. Emo Xiaoyao muttered to himself for a moment and then said in a low voice, Elder Su no longer has anything to worry about in the capital. If he's willing to stay in the northwest, I will naturally take care of him until he grows old. If he still can't let go of the imperial court, then I'll send someone to secretly take care of him. Yili frowned and sighed softly. You know that I'm not talking about this. Su Zuodi is Elder Su's only family. The reason why Mo Jingqi sent an old man in his 70s over thousands of miles away is probably because of this, right? In the past few days, half of the assassins who broke into the mansion were Mo Jingqi's people. It seems that Mo Jingqi is different from Tan Jiji. He doesn't seem to want Su Zuodi to die. Emo Xiaoyao's eyes flashed with a trace of scarlet. He said lightly, Su Zuodi must die. Elder Su won't plead for her. Suju was an upright person and hated people who betrayed him the most. When Su Zuodi fled the capital, it was behind Suju's back. But with Suju's character, he would definitely not recognize Su Zuodi as his granddaughter. Yili held his hand and said softly, Lord Su has taught you since you were young. I won't be soft-hearted towards Su Zuodi, but I also don't want to disappoint Elder Su because of this. Even if Elder Su and Su Zuodi cut off all ties, she is still his granddaughter and his only family in this world. It's not good to have a grudge in his heart. Then don't let Elder Su know. Emo Xiaoyao said lightly. In any case, it's been a stalemate for so long, and there's still no progress on Qin Feng's side. Then there's no need to ask. She's not the only one who knows the so-called secret. Let Qin Feng finish her off. Chapter 425. Nonsense. Yili softly said, If Lord Su just came and she died, what do you want the old man to think? All right. She comfortingly hugged Emo Xiaoyao, brushed away the white hair by his ear, and softly said, Lord Su is not only your benevolent teacher, he is also a clear stream in the court with countless students and followers. It is reasonable for us to give him some face. Emo Xiaoyao coldly said, Are we just going to let her go like this? Reaching out his hand to tightly hold her in his embrace, Emo Xiaoyao closed his eyes to calm the killing intent in his heart. He really did not want these people to still be alive. Su Zuodi, Lei Jinting, Marquis Muyang, and Mo Jingqi, as long as he saw them or even thought of them, the scene of Li Li falling off the cliff would appear in his mind. He even felt that everything was like a dream, and when he woke up from this dream, it would still be the time when he lost Li Li, sensing the cold and lonely aura coming from Emo Xiaoyao's body. Yili raised her head and saw his blank expression with a trace of despair. Yili's heart ached, and she hurriedly held his hand in front of her heart and softly said, All right, it's my fault. I thought too much. If you don't like it, I will let Qin Feng kill Su Zuodi. Emo Xiaoyao held the girl in front of him in his embrace and took a deep breath. Smelling the familiar and quiet fragrance, his originally gloomy mood suddenly became much better. He liked how Li Li complied with him. Gently rubbing Yili's hair, Emo Xiaoyao softly laughed and said, I know that Li is doing this for my own good. Su Zuodi's matter is not urgent. Of course he knew that Li Li said this for him. The Ding imperial household had originally made enemies everywhere, and now that they had fallen out with the court, it could be said that as long as one held power in this world, they would be their enemy. Under such circumstances, the more people who supported him, the easier it would be for the Mahist army. Ever since Mr. Qingyun left the court, it could be said that Suju was the leader of the Qing faction in the court. Although he did not have much real power, these people controlled the way of speech and public opinion. Once he and Suju became enemies, he was afraid that most of the scholars in the world would not have a good impression of him. Yili's eyes flashed with a trace of sharpness, and she said softly, Leave Su Zuodi and Elder Su to me. I won't let you see her again in the future. Yili discovered that she had misjudged Su Zuodi's influence on Emo Xiaoyao. It wasn't that she suspected that Emo Xiaoyao still had feelings for Su Zuidi, but Su Zuidi would obviously make Emo Xiaoyao think of some bad things, which would seriously affect his mood. Since that was the case, she could not allow Su Zuidi to continue living, no matter what the reason was. As for Suja, if Elder Su was really like Emo Xiaoyao said, then perhaps there was a way to solve it. Princess. The two returned to the Prince Ding mansion and sat down. Zhuo Jing and Lin Han had obviously been waiting for a long time. Emo Xiaoyao turned to the two, still holding Yi Li's waist with one hand, and asked, "How is the mansion?" Zhuo Jing reported, "Prince's prediction is like a god. The guards that Prince De brought, as well as the people that arrived in Riyang in the past 2 days, have already besieged the governor's mansion." The other side had clearly chosen a good time. Tonight, the whole city was celebrating, and the east side of the city was even more lively. Even though the governor's mansion had caused such a big commotion, no one had noticed. Emo Xiao raised his eyebrows and laughed. "Oh? Besieging the governor's mansion?" Lin Han said, "Because Prince and Princess suddenly moved to a new mansion, the other side obviously did not notice. That's why they forced their way into the governor's mansion to rescue Su Zuidi. Because they did not make a big fuss when they moved, it was basically just the prince and princess moving in with their own belongings. Therefore, whether it was the guards who came with Prince De but were stopped outside the city, or the people who had been hiding in the city for a long time, none of them noticed, not to mention that Su Zuidi had been secretly moved to another place a day ago." "Rescue? Not to silence her?" Yi Li raised her eyebrows and asked. Zhuo Jing said, "This subordinate is certain that the other side did not intend to silence Su Zuidi. This time, the other side sent out extremely skilled martial artists. After breaking into the dungeon, they had at least 3 chances to kill the substitute in the dungeon. But the other side only wanted to bring her out, and did not make a move." "Interesting." Yi Li lowered her eyebrows and muttered to herself. Emo Jingqi's people wanted to save Su Zuidi. This did not make sense in any way. If Su Zuidi knew some secret that she should not know, Emo Jingqi should only want to silence her. The price of saving someone like this was a bit too high. Emo Xiaoyao held her hand and smiled. Li does not need to be so worried. The more he does, the more mistakes he makes. Sooner or later, we will know why. Did they leave anyone alive? Zhuo Jing nodded and smiled, reporting to the prince. The harvest this time was quite big. The leader was actually the deputy commander of the Chu capital's imperial guards. There were also a few famous Jianghu experts who were all detained. Emo Xiaoyao nodded with satisfaction. After all these days of enduring those good-for-nothings causing trouble, he finally caught a few big fish. He ordered in a low voice, "There is no need to interrogate them. Emo Jingqi will not tell them anything. Send the deputy commanders head back to the capital to Emo Jingqi. As for those Jianghu experts, you can ask them properly." The Jianghu people did not like to be restrained by the court. Even assassins were paid to kill and rarely listened to the court's orders. There must be a reason why Emo Jingqi could mobilize so many Jianghu experts at once. Yes. Speaking of the commander of the Imperial Guards and experts, where are Lung Qingyu and Mu Qingsong now? Yi Li asked. Emo Xiaoyao smiled. Lung Qingyu returned to the capital. Although this person is arrogant and not flexible, he is still human compared to those sly old foxes. For Lung Er's sake, I have to let him live. As for Mu Qingsong, he is in Riyang. Does Li want to see him? Mu Qingsong was not just anyone. Not only was he Marquis Muyang's illegitimate son, but he was also one of the top 5 experts in the world. Emo Xiaoyao naturally would not put him in a place that he could not see. If someone took advantage of this loophole, it would be very troublesome. Yi Li thought for a moment and said, "I do have something I want him to do, but Mu Qingsong is not easy to control. Let's wait a little longer." Emo Xiaoyao did not mind and nodded. Just as he was about to say something, the guard outside the door reported, "Prince, Lord Suja requests an audience." Emo Xiaoyao was startled. Only then did he remember that Suja was old and could not bear the long journey. He was already exhausted, so he did not attend tonight's welcome banquet and was resting in the residence. He sat up and glanced at Yili before saying in a deep voice, "Quickly invite Elder Su in." Su just stepped into the study, and Mo Xiaoyao stood up to greet him to show his respect. Su waved his hand and said, Princess Consort, this old man has disturbed you." After inviting Su to sit down, Mo Xiaoyao sat down and said with a smile, "Elder Su is so polite, but you are estranged from Xiaoyao." Su looked at the young man and woman sitting side by side in front of him. His gaze lingered on Mo Xiaoyao's snow-like white hair for a while before he sighed and said, "Prince does not cherish his body like this. How can the regent Princess Consort and your brother rest in peace?" Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and looked down at the white hair hanging in front of his chest. He said with a smile, "Xiaoyao knows he is wrong. Thank you for your concern, Elder Su." Su shook his head and looked at Yili sitting to the side. He nodded and said with a smile, "Princess Consort's safe return is due to the blessings of the ancestors of the Prince Ding mansion." Yili smiled faintly and said softly, "Elder Su is right. Yili's safe return this time is due to the blessings of the ancestors." Yili understood that Su was dissatisfied with her, but she did not feel angry. She could feel that Su's dissatisfaction with her was not because of himself, but because of Mo Xiaoyao. He was blaming Mo Xiaoyao for having white hair overnight because of her. In the end, he was concerned about his student Mo Xiaoyao and did not have any selfish motives. Chapter 4:26. Mo Xiaoyao reached out to hold Yili's hand and smiled at Suja. "Elder Su is right. In 2 months, Miss Li will give birth. At that time, the Prince Ding mansion will have a successor. Xiaoyao still hopes that Elder Su will dote on the child." Hearing Mo Xiaoyao's words, Suja's expression became even softer. He had lost his children and grandchildren in his old age. Even his only granddaughter was gone. In this life, he was destined to be alone. Hearing Mo Xiaoyao mention children, the love in his heart was uncontrollable. It was as if she could see a handsome and intelligent child like Mo Xiaoyao when he was young surrounding her and enjoying the beautiful scenery. How could she still care about Yili's expression? Suja sighed softly and asked, "Your Highness has suffered a lot over the years. Us old men can't do much to help. These 2 years, it's all thanks to Wang Fei's care." The emperor was very wary of these old officials who had a relationship with Mo Lufeng and the Prince Ding mansion. In these years, they could only watch in secret and couldn't do much. Looking at the white-haired man who had a thin figure but a sharp presence, Suja's heart also dimmed. After so many years, Suja could still clearly remember Mo Xiaoyao's appearance when he was young. The second young master of the Ding mansion, he was doted on by his father and protected by his older brother. At that time, the youth in embroidered clothes was bright and noble. He was like a bright flame flying across the capital, with a childish frivolity and pride. After a while, he led the army into battle and was invincible. Before he was 16, he was called the Young War God. Every time he won, there would be countless noble young ladies who would break their heads just to see the Young War God's silhouette. He was the dream of many young ladies. At that time, how spirited and peerless was Mo Xiaoyao, making countless people only dare to look up to him and have no face to stand shoulder to shoulder with him. However, the present Mo Xiaoyao was only 26 or 27 years old, and his eyes no longer had the fire and elegance of the past. The flames that occasionally flashed in his indifferent eyes were ice cold. His handsome face, coupled with his head of snow-white hair, only made people feel a chill in their hearts. If the young Mo Xiaoyao was a peerless beauty that made people look up to him, then the current Mo Xiaoyao was more like the cold snow at the peak of a mountain that made people have no choice but to stop. That peerless youth, the Chu State's future god of war, had been destroyed in the end. Xiaoyao will never forget Elder Su's kindness in teaching me. Mo Xiaoyao smiled indifferently. Suja shook his head, no longer thinking about the past, and said seriously, "Prince, do you know why the emperor sent Prince Yu and Prince De here?" Mo Xiaoyao was silent for a moment, then nodded slightly. Although Prince Yu did not finish speaking, Xiaoyao understood. "Mo Jingqi wants me to return to the capital?" Suja nodded. He looked at Emo Xiaoyao and said seriously, "You cannot go back." Elder Su. Emo Xiaoyao was somewhat shocked. Suja was an upright person and was loyal to the Dechu state. Although he understood that Suja would not harm him, Emo Xiaoyao was still somewhat shocked to hear him stop him from returning to the capital. Suja closed his eyes tiredly. After saying these words, he seemed to have aged a lot. Although he rarely stepped into the core of the court, Emo Jingqi's intentions were too obvious. He naturally understood the result that Emo Jingqi wanted by sending him here. Even if it was for the stability of the Dechu state, he also agreed that it was a good idea for Emo Xiaoyao to return to the capital. Because the current Emo Xiaoyao, no one could be sure if his heart was still with the Dechu state. But he also knew that once Emo Xiaoyao returned to the capital, what awaited him would not be the Ding King manner of the past, nor would he be imprisoned. He would directly lose his life. In private, Emo Xiaoyao was his student, a junior he had watched grow up. In public, the Dechu state was surrounded by powerful enemies. Emo Xiaoyao and the Mahist army were the only ones who could contend against them. Thus, he could only stop Emo Xiaoyao from returning to the capital. Suja opened his eyes and looked at Emo Xiaoyao. Since Prince knows this, he must have already made a plan. That's what I meant, and it's also what Duqua meant. Before leaving, Duqua wanted me to pass a message to Prince. Emo Xiaoyao lowered his brows, saying, "Elder Su, please speak." The study was silent. Only Suja's voice could be heard in the empty room. Elder Hua said that the Ding King manor has been loyal to the Dechu state for generations and has never let down the royal family or the great ancestor. Right now, the Prince Ding manor is only left with the prince's bloodline. Prince should make plans for the Prince Ding manor and the hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the Mahist army. Duke Hua's manor has received the grace of 2 generations of emperors and should do their best for the Dechu state until their deaths. I only ask Prince, in the future, if the Dechu state is in trouble, I ask Prince to protect the people of the Dechu state from being massacred by the foreign races on account of the fact that we are of the same origin. Emo Xiaoyao was slightly shaken and raised his eyes to look at Suja. Duke Hua's words had already determined that the Mahist army was bound to leave the Dechu state. As expected of an old general who had fought on the battlefield for a lifetime. Although Duke Hua was far away from the court, perhaps he was the one who could see the clearest. What plans does Duke Hua have? Emo Xiaoyao asked in a low voice. Suja said lightly, "The Dechu state is filled with the flames of war. On the day we left the capital, Duke Hua mentioned that he planned to send a memorial to the emperor to lead the troops out. I'm afraid that the memorial has already been placed on the emperor's table." Emo Xiaoyao furrowed his brows, saying, "Duke Hua is already over 70 years old. The war situation has not reached the point where an elder needs to personally take action." Yi Li patted Emo Xiaoyao's hand, softly saying, "The emperor will not allow Duke Hua to lead the troops out so easily." Emo Xiaoyao nodded slightly. Emo Jingqi was very wary of these old generals. Unless there was no other choice, he would not give military authority to Duke Hua. Suja said, "Right now, the emperor is acting against the grain. He is no longer willing to listen to good officials' advice on governing the country. Instead, he is focused on scheming. Dechu state." With a long sigh, Suja continued, "Prince staying in the northwest was the right choice. Once he returns to the capital, I'm afraid that an inescapable net will be set up in the capital. If General Mo is destroyed, the Dechu state will perish." After speaking, Suja stood up and said, "This old man wants to say this much. Princess consort, please take care. In 2 days, we will be returning to the capital. I don't know when we will meet again. Elder Su, the emperor must have sent you here to persuade Prince to return to the capital. If you act like this, how will you explain to the emperor when you return?" Yi Li asked softly. Suja turned to look at her, calmly saying with a smile, "This old man is already 73 years old. It is rare to live for 70 years. What else do I have to explain?" Yi Li frowned. Emo Jingqi was not a soft-hearted person. Once Suja returned, even if Emo Jingqi did not sentence him to death, he might not be able to endure a casual punishment. Yi Li stood up. "Emo Xiaoyao, who was sitting by her side, hurriedly and carefully helped her up to Suja. Yili bowed slightly, saying, "The northwest is far from the Chu capital. The journey is long and bumpy. Elder Su is already so old. Why don't you rest in the northwest for a few days and enjoy your later years?" Suja smiled as he looked at Yili, saying, "Many thanks for Princess Consort's concern. This old man was born in the Chu capital and grew up in the Chu capital. I have spent almost my entire life in the Chu capital. Having lived to this age, there is nothing I cannot let go of. I only hope that I can die at home and be buried in the Chu capital. Prince and Princess Consort have governed the Northwest very well. Unfortunately, it is not this old man's home." Chapter 427. Emo Xiuyao frowned and helped Yili to sit back down. Then he turned to look at Suja and asked, "Elder Su, don't you want to ask about her?" Suja was stunned. His wrinkled face dimmed, and the muscles on his face trembled uncontrollably. After a while, Suja asked in a deep voice, "Is she still alive?" Of course, he knew that Su Zuidi was still alive. Before leaving the capital, the emperor told him this news and said that he was willing to send people to rescue Su Zuidi. But Suja understood even more clearly why did Emo Xiuyao catch Zuidi. His granddaughter, who had died of illness 9 years ago, was still alive. As long as he recalled the time of Su Zuidi's death and the situation at that time, what else did Suja not understand? When Emo Xiuyao was just injured, the Prince Ding mansion was in chaos and no one was in charge. It was all thanks to great elder princess's support. He sent Zuidi to the Prince Ding mansion to take care of Emo Xiuyao's injury. Although they were not married yet, there was no one in the Prince Ding mansion, so it was natural for Zuidi, who was his fiancée, to take care of him. But his granddaughter fell ill the next day and was sent back. At that time, he only thought that Zuidi had been spoiled since childhood and was frightened, but he did not expect. But even so, Xiuyao had let Zuidi go back then and had no reason to catch her again. She must have done something to make Xiuyao be so heartless. Emo Xiuyao nodded and said in a deep voice, "She is in the Prince Ding mansion." The study fell into silence again. After a long time, Suja asked, "What did she do?" Emo Xiuyao hesitated for a moment, got up and took a file from the side table and handed it over. It recorded all the things that happened to Su Zuidi in the past 10 years. Suja took it and opened the thick file with trembling fingers. He quickly flipped through it, and the more he read, the uglier his face became. Yili leaned against the couch and carefully observed Suja's expression. She couldn't help but reveal a look of pity on her face. After a long time, Suja raised his head from the file and said with a trembling voice, "Okay, what a good Su Zuidi. What a good Bai Long. Lady Bai of Xiling, Imperial Consort Qingrong, Genom of Gojoseon spy. Good. You are truly my Suja's granddaughter." Elder Su. Seeing Suja's pale face, Yili frowned and said worriedly. At the same time, he waved his hand to signal Zhuijing, who had been watching from the outside, to invite Shenyang over. Suja waved his hand and slumped back into his chair. He lowered his head and looked at the file in his trembling hands. Was there something wrong with his teaching? His granddaughter, who had always been obedient and docile in his eyes, had actually done so many things behind his back. At the age of 15, she had gotten acquainted with the orphan of the royal family of the previous dynasty. After her fiancé was seriously injured, she could even instigate Master Mingyu to help her fake her death to escape. In Xiling, she had even used the identity of the Bai family to become the imperial consort of Xiling. She had interacted with the emperor of Xiling and Genom of Gojoseon. She had even reached the point where she could threaten the emperor of Xiling, and she had sent people to assassinate the unmarried Princess Ding. Was this his granddaughter? Suja suddenly remembered that many years ago, the current emperor had secretly expressed his intention to bring Su Zuidi into the palace as a consort. At that time, he had flatly refused with the reason that Su Zuidi was already engaged. In fact, even if Su Zuidi and Emo Xiuyao were not engaged at that time, he still wouldn't have agreed to let his granddaughter enter the palace. But who would have thought that she didn't become the imperial consort of the Chu state, but the imperial consort of Xiling? Finally, Suja seemed to have calmed down. He stood up and said, "This old man is tired, so I won't disturb the prince's consort any longer. As for that evil creature..." Suja closed his eyes tiredly, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly. "Let the prince's consort do as she pleases. The Su family doesn't have such a granddaughter." After he finished speaking, he didn't look at Imo Xiaoyao and Yili anymore and strode out the door. Yili hurriedly signaled for Lin Han to follow. As expected, they had only taken a few steps when they heard Lin Han's voice outside the door. "Lord Su! Lord Su!" Imo Xiaoyao rushed out the door and saw Suja on the ground being supported by Lin Han. The dark pool of blood on the ground was a ghastly sight under the moonlight. Imo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes and said lightly, "Send Elder Su back." Behind him, Yili walked to his side and held his hand. The two watched as Suja was sent back to the guest room by Lin Han. Looking at Imo Xiaoyao's indifferent expression, Yili said softly, "Why are you like this? Didn't you say that you would leave Su Zuidi's matter to me?" Imo Xiaoyao looked at her quietly. Yili leaned into his arms and said softly, "I know that you don't want to make things difficult for me, but since I am the king's consort, isn't it my duty to deal with these matters? If something happens to Lord Su because of this, would you be able to let it go?" Imo Xiaoyao was silent and only reached out to pull her into his arms. Even though she was more than 7 months pregnant, Yili still looked thin and slender. The two leaned against each other, the moonlight quietly falling on their bodies, making people's hearts feel exceptionally peaceful. Inside the Chu palace, the window was half closed, the silver moonlight quietly falling into the garden outside the window, and the air was filled with a strange fragrance. At the corner of the wall outside the window, a white flower slowly bloomed with a beautiful charm. The snow-white flower bloomed like a lotus, but it was even more holy and noble than a lotus, like a white fairy dancing alone under the moonlight. In front of the window, a beautiful woman in white lazily leaned against the window, letting the moonlight fall on her body. Her indifferent eyes casually looked at the blooming epiphyllum outside the window, lost in thought. Pure as ice and pure as jade, only blooming in the middle of the night, not competing with other flowers. "This epiphyllum is the most beautiful flower in the world, isn't it?" A man's laughing voice sounded in the room, but there seemed to be a hint of ridicule in his laughter. The woman in white didn't even bother to turn her head and said indifferently, "If there is no one who cherishes flowers, what is the use of being beautiful?" The man smiled and said, "How can that be? How many people have waited all night to see this epiphyllum bloom, but unfortunately, they can't see it. Epiphyllum bloom. Only for Skunda, this really is a flower that makes people both love and hate it." The woman in white, noble consort Lu, sat up and looked coldly at the man in the hall. "What are you doing here? Mo Jingqi has sent people everywhere to look for you, and you still dare to come to the palace?" There were no candles in the hall. In the darkness, a man strolled out. The moonlight shone on his body, adding a strange aura. "I came, naturally, to tell you my harvest from this trip to the capital. One good news, one bad news. Which one does noble consort Lu want to hear?" Noble consort Lu looked at him indifferently, as if unmoved. The man smiled helplessly and said, "News about Imo Xiaoyao. Are you also not interested?" Noble consort Lu's cold eyes moved slightly, and she stared at the man who was deliberately mystifying her. The man said with some frustration, "Fine. The good news is that your enemy, Su Zuidi, is now in Prince Ding's hands, and she has been tortured until she is half dead. It seems that Prince Ding has really cut off all ties with her. The bad news is, Princess Ding returned to Riyang City alive, and she is 7 months pregnant. In 2 months, the heir of the Prince Ding mansion will be born." "Yili is still alive?" Noble consort Lu said coldly. "You have seen Yili?" The man nodded and said, "She fell into my hands. Originally, I wanted to use her to threaten Mo Xiaoyao, but..." Chapter 428. Whiz! A hidden weapon pierced through the air, and the man dodged to the side. Noble Consort Lu, who was in front of the window, had already stood up and stared at him angrily. Tan Jiji, you've seen Yili before. Why didn't you just kill her? The man was Tan Jiji, who had disappeared after leaving the Northwest. Tan Jiji helplessly said, if I really killed Yili, do you think I would still be able to come back alive? Noble Consort Lu looked at him with disgust and said, don't forget our deal. I only want Yili to die. It seems that you have forgotten. Tan Jiji looked at the beautiful woman who was as cold as ice in front of him, and a strange light flashed through his eyes. How could I dare to forget Noble Consort's wish? But you can't ask me to exchange my life for Yili's life, right? Don't worry, as long as our matter is done, not to mention Yili, Mo Xiaoyao can also be handed over to you to deal with. Noble Consort Lu coldly said, that's your business. Don't involve me in your trivial matters. Tan Jiji spread out his hands. Well, it's my business. What did His Majesty do after I left the capital? Noble Consort Lu coldly said, he was already stupid, but now he's even more stupid. Tan Jiji smiled gloomily. He's stupid. I heard that he sent Do Wang and Yu Wang to the northwest to let Mo Xiaoyao return to the capital. Which idiot came up with this idea? Does he think that Mo Xiaoyao is as brainless as him? Noble Consort Lu indifferently said, so, what if Mo Xiaoyao doesn't come back? I'm afraid that Do Wang and Yu Wang won't be able to come back. Tan Jiji lowered his head and thought for a moment, then smiled and said, so it was Noble Consort's idea. Announcing Mo Xiaoyao's return to the capital was a lie, and using this to get rid of Do Wang and Yu Wang was the real deal? However, I'm afraid that Noble Consort will be disappointed. Mo Xiaoyao may not kill those two princes. Noble Consort Lu looked at Tan Jiji coldly. Tan Jiji continued, however, since Noble Consort Lu doesn't like them, I will do everything for you. It has nothing to do with me. Noble Consort Lu turned around and continued to admire the epiphyllum in front of her. Nothing to do with me? Tan Jiji looked at the woman who was as beautiful as a fairy in front of him with great interest. Since the first time he saw Noble Consort Lu, he felt this woman was very interesting. She had no ambition and did not care about the emperor's favor at all. In this deep palace, she was like a snow lotus blooming alone at the peak of a mountain, coldly looking down at the people in the palace. At that time, he thought that this was just a way for her to gain favor. After all, the emperor was used to countless women fawning over him. A beauty with a cold personality was especially attractive. But he soon realized that she really didn't care about these things. If the emperor came, she would wait indifferently. If the emperor didn't come, she didn't care either. If she continued to be like this, he would have to admire this woman. But in the end, he found her weakness. Prince Ding, Mo Xiaoyao. Noble Consort Lu really loved Mo Xiaoyao. And unlike Su Zuidi, who loved him for some complicated reasons, she simply loved Mo Xiaoyao. She didn't even care if Mo Xiaoyao was the second son of the Prince Ding mansion, the Prince of Dinghua, or an ordinary commoner. She also didn't care if Mo Xiaoyao was fighting on the battlefield or lying in bed with disabled legs. Tan Jiji felt that he was about to be moved by her infatuation. Unfortunately, Mo Xiaoyao never had her in his eyes. If the world's #1 beauty, Su Zuidi, who was Mo Xiaoyao's childhood sweetheart, couldn't capture Mo Xiaoyao's heart, then what hope could a daughter of the Lu family, whom Mo Xiaoyao didn't like very much, have? Even if Noble Consort Lu wasn't inferior to Su Zuidi. Originally, Noble Consort Lu didn't care because if she couldn't have Mo Xiaoyao, no one else could either. She could even lie to herself that it wasn't that Mo Xiaoyao didn't love her, but that he didn't know how to love at all. But now, Mo Xiaoyao was deeply in love with his wife in the Northwest, and it wouldn't be long before their child was born. He didn't believe that Noble Consort Lu could still hold herself back. Seeing that Noble Consort Lu wasn't moved, Tan Jiji sighed and said slowly, Noble Consort Lu, are you really willing to spend the rest of your life in the palace? In 2 months, Prince Ding's son will be born, huh? Prince Ding will definitely be more devoted to Princess Ding. At that time, I'm afraid that no one in the world will be able to enter Prince Ding's eyes. I heard that, back then, Prince Ding was promised to the Su family. In this life, he will only have Princess Ding. Noble consort Lu suddenly turned her head and shot a cold gaze at the man under the moonlight. The Su family? The Su family and Xiao. Prince Ding have something to do with each other? Noble consort Lu, don't tell me you also believe that the Su family is aloof from worldly affairs and won't help either side? Tan Jiji smiled. Don't forget. Ever since Prince Ding occupied Riyang, even Leng Qingyu and Mu Yang were released, but there has been no news of the Su family's second son, Su Qingze. Since Mo Xiaoyao even let Leng Qingyu and Mu Yang go, he wouldn't detain his wife's uncle, right? Naturally, it's Su Qingze who refuses to come back. Noble consort Lu said lightly. Even so. So what? Su Hongyan is in the capital, and Mr. Qingyun and Su Hongyu are in Yunzhou. As long as these three don't make a move, what can the Su family do even if the 5 young masters come to Riyang? His Majesty won't easily touch the Su family. Tan Jiji chuckled in a low voice. Noble consort Lu, why don't you tell His Majesty about the Su family's deeds when the Chu state was founded? His Majesty may understand that even with Su Hongyan and Su Qingyun in his hands, he may not be safe. Noble consort Lu looked at him strangely and said, why don't you tell him yourself? He has been sending people everywhere to look for you these days, thinking that you were secretly harmed by Prince Ding. Tan Jiji shrugged helplessly and gritted his teeth. That bitch Su Zuidi told Mo Xiaoyao my identity. Once I appear in the palace again, it's hard to guarantee that Mo Xiaoyao won't disclose this matter to His Majesty. Noble consort Lu sneered. So, young Master Tan still has dealings with Su Zuidi. Does the title of the world's most beautiful woman live up to its name? Tan Jiji said, of course not as beautiful as Noble consort Lu. Who knows how badly that bitch Su Zuidi has been tortured by Mo Xiaoyao. It's a pity that my people haven't found a chance to kill her. When Su Zuidi was mentioned, Tan Jiji felt hatred in his heart. When he was young and frivolous, he always thought that Mo Xiaoyao's fiancée was more beautiful than other women. Now it seemed that a beauty like Noble consort Lu was the real beauty. If there was medicine for regret in this world, he would never have provoked that woman Su Zuidi back then. Looking at Noble consort Lu's icy face, Tan Jiji softened his voice and said, Noble consort Lu, you should think about it carefully. Apart from the Su family, it's not that Noble consort Lu doesn't have any benefits, right? As long as you get rid of the Su family, it's like cutting off one of Princess Ding's arms. Seeing Noble consort Lu remain silent, Tan Jiji understood that she was a little moved. He continued, the treasures of the previous dynasty are in the northwest, including the imperial jade seal, the great ancestors' art of war, and wealth. Now it's probably all owned by Mo Xiaoyao. Noble consort Lu, you can disclose this information to His Majesty, which can be considered as fulfilling our relationship as monarch and minister. Noble consort Lu sneered. Even Mo Jingqi himself doesn't know about it. How can I explain how I know about it? Tan Jiji raised his eyebrows and smiled. He said, if that's the case, I won't force you. I'll ask Lord Lu to do it. I shouldn't have troubled Noble consort Lu in the first place. Chapter 429. You can go now. Noble consort Lu said. Tan Jiji sighed. Noble consort Lu, you are really heartless. You and I have known each other for many years. The Emperor is here. The eunuch's sharp voice came from outside the palace gate. Tan Jiji's eyes flashed. It's so late. Why is the Emperor here? Noble consort Lu stood up and said lightly, he is the Emperor. Who can stop him when he wants to come? Tan Jiji sighed helplessly. That's why everyone in the world wants to be the Emperor. Please take care of yourself, Noble consort Lu, I'll leave first. Seeing Tan Jiji disappear into the darkness, Noble consort Lu lowered her head and stayed silent for a while, then said lightly, not everyone is interested in that position. If that person was really interested in that position, she would do anything for him, even if she had to give him everything. She just wanted him to look at her seriously. She tidied up her clothes slowly. Mo Jingqi's carriage had already arrived outside the palace. Stepping into the palace, Missouri Jingqi looked at the dark room and frowned. Why don't you light the lamps? Where are all the servants? Just by hearing Mo Jingqi's tone, noble consort Lu knew that he was in a bad mood right now. It was said that noble consort Lu was the most favored in the palace, and the emperor often went against the empress dowager for her. But only noble consort Lu knew that it was just because Mo Jingqi was in a good mood. When Mo Jingqi was in a good mood, he was naturally favored, but when he was in a bad mood, it was the people closest to him who suffered. Therefore, noble consort Lu never looked down on the empress who was neglected. Mo Jingqi didn't favor her, but gave her the power to lead the harem. And he never lost his temper with her. Therefore, the empress was the most comfortable person in the palace, even if the reason was that Mo Jingqi didn't want to get close to the empress because he was guarding against the Hua family. "Forgive me, your majesty. I asked them to leave," noble consort Lu said lightly. The maids and eunuchs who followed Mo Jingqi quietly entered the palace, lit all the candles, and then left silently. The hall was bright under the candlelight, and there was a faint fragrance in the air. Mo Jingqi looked at noble consort Lu and said, "It's so late. Why haven't you gone to bed yet?" Noble consort Lu said calmly, "Damn the epiphyllum outside the window. I was too greedy and forgot the time."
Oh.
Mo Jingqi raised his eyebrows and walked to the half-open window. Sure enough, he saw a blooming epiphyllum under the window. Only then did he say with a smile, "So I've disturbed my beloved concubine's mood of admiring the flowers?" Noble consort Lu remained silent, tacitly agreeing. Mo Jingqi was already used to her personality, so he didn't mind. If noble consort Lu was too warm and friendly to him, he would be suspicious. Looking at the exceptionally beautiful woman under the moonlight, Mo Jingqi's eyes flashed with a trace of lust. He pulled her over and kissed her fiercely against the window. The fierce entanglement of their tongues didn't end until noble consort Lu was out of breath. Mo Jingqi lowered his head to look at the woman in his arms. His eyes were still cold and indifferent, as if everything that had happened just now was just an illusion. Staring at noble consort Lu's beautiful face, Mo Jingqi's expression was complicated and hard to distinguish. There was anger and unwillingness, as well as deep infatuation and jealousy. Instead, it made the original desire completely fade away. "It's so late. What's the matter, your majesty?" Noble consort Lu pushed Mo Jingqi away gently, walked back to the couch in the hall, sat down, and asked. Mo Jingqi's face darkened. He walked to noble consort Lu's side and sat down. He gritted his teeth and said, "Hua Chunfeng, that old bastard, sent a memorial today saying that he's going to lead an army to battles." Noble consort Lu looked up at him in confusion. Mo Jingqi snorted and said, "He's dreaming. He's already so old, so he should stay at home and wait for death. For the sake of the empress and Chang'e, I'll let him die of old age. Mo Xiaoyao just got into trouble, and he wants military power. I'll make him die a horrible death sooner or later." Noble consort Lu calmly listened to Mo Jingqi scolding Duke Hua and the officials in the court who protected the Prince Ding mansion. She wouldn't speak ill of Duke Hua, and Mo Jingqi didn't need her to scold Duke Hua with him. He just needed someone to listen to him. When Mo Jingqi finally finished scolding, he turned around and saw noble consort Lu sitting on the side in a daze. He said unhappily, "What are you thinking about?" Noble consort Lu lowered her eyes and said, "Your Majesty is in a bad mood today. Is it because of Duke Hua?" Mo Jingqi snorted and said, "I don't have time to deal with that old bastard Hua Chinfeng right now. Tan Jiji still hasn't come back. I'm afraid that Mo Xiaoyao secretly killed him." Those good-for-nothings came back and said that many people saw Tan Jiji leave Riyang with their own eyes. Mo Xiaoyao has improved. Do you think you can fool me with this kind of trick? In the past, if Mo Xiaoyao didn't want to let Tan Jiji go, he would definitely not let him go. If he wanted to kill Tan Jiji, he would definitely stab him in the open. It would be useless to say anything. Now, he let him go on the surface, but secretly stabbed him. After so many years, Mo Xiaoyao had indeed improved a lot. Noble consort Lu lowered her eyes and hid the expression in her eyes. Your Majesty sent official Tan to the northwest. Naturally, you would think that he might fall into Prince Ding's hands. Mo Jingqi cursed in a low voice and said angrily, Tan Jiji is also useless. Not only was he captured by Mo Xiaoyao, even the Princess Ding was rescued by Mo Xiaoyao. Speaking of this, Mo Jingqi was so angry that his liver hurt. If Yili was captured, and she was even pregnant Yili, wouldn't Mo Xiaoyao obediently listen to him? Such a good opportunity was lost in vain. How could Mo Jingqi not be angry? Noble consort Lu raised her eyes and said, Official Tan has always been your Majesty's trusted aide. Why did your Majesty send Official Tan to the northwest? This concubine has overstepped. I shouldn't have asked about the matters of the imperial court. Mo Jingqi waved his hand and said, It's nothing. I naturally believe you. It's said that the previous dynasty's founder's imperial tomb and treasure are in the northwest. Tan Jiji went there for this. I just didn't expect. Noble consort Lu pondered for a moment and said, Then, now the previous dynasty's treasure is all in the Mahist army's possession. Mo Jingqi's face was full of anger. He stood up and said, That's right. If the previous dynasty's founder's legacy and treasure are really in the northwest, the Mahist army's strength will definitely reach a higher level. Damn that Tan Jiji. As if she didn't see Mo Jingqi's anger, noble consort Lu continued, and I'm afraid it's not just the legacy and treasure. There's also the imperial jade seal. Mo Jingqi's face changed. He quickly looked at noble consort Lu and asked suspiciously, How do you know that there's the imperial jade seal in the emperor's tomb? Noble consort Lu's expression changed slightly. She raised her head and looked at him and said, It's also recorded in the history books that the previous dynasty's founder did get the imperial jade seal. The imperial edict with the imperial jade seal was also found among the relics left in the previous dynasty's palace. But after the previous dynasty's founder died, no one in the world has seen the imperial jade seal. It's obvious that the founder didn't pass it down to his descendants. Since that's the case, the imperial jade seal is very likely to be in the imperial tomb. It can't be that the previous dynasty's founder just threw the imperial jade seal into a random river, right? Mo Jingqi looked at noble consort Lu carefully. After a while, he said, My dear consort, you rarely talk so much. It seems you really hate Mo Xiaoyao and Yili to the core? Noble consort Lu didn't hide it at all. Does the emperor not hate them? Mo Jingqi nodded and said, My dear consort is right. I hate them too. Noble consort Lu hated Mo Xiaoyao for not loving her. She hated Yili for taking away her love. She hated the king's family's strength and reputation. She hated Mo Xiaoyao's identity and talent even more. He was the late emperor's son. Mo Xiaoyao was only the second son of the king's family. But when he was young and carefully struggled in the palace, Missouri Xiaoyao was the person that everyone in the Chu capital, including the princes, wanted to befriend and curry favor with. The brothers schemed against each other and fought to the death for their father's favor. Even their own blood brother from the same mother had to be on guard against him. Mo Xiaoyao was willfully unrestrained. No matter what kind of trouble he caused, his elder brother, Mo Xiaowen, would helplessly follow behind and clean up for him. When he didn't sleep at all and worked hard to write a policy article to win a smile from his father, Mo Xiaoyao only needed to casually wave his brush and write a chapter to win the praise of the entire court. He was also a prince, but even the girl he liked was infatuated with Mo Xiaoyao. When he was still a prince, he had already sworn that one day he would trample Mo Xiaoyao and the Prince Ding mansion under his feet. Chapter 430. Thinking about noble consort Lu's deduction, Mo Jingqi's face became more and more gloomy. If Mo Xiaoyao really got the imperial jade seal, then would it really be the mandate of heaven? It seemed that Mo Xiaoyao really wanted to rule the world. Thinking of this, Mo Jingqi naturally couldn't sit still. He stood up and walked out. Noble consort Lu didn't stop him. She just watched him go out with an indifferent expression. Hearing the sound of the imperial carriage, the palace was silent again. You didn't mention the Su family. Tan Jizi's voice sounded in the palace. You haven't left yet. Noble consort Lu's face darkened. She said unhappily. Knowing that he wasn't welcome, Tan Jiji didn't force her. He said, I'm leaving right away. It seems that His Majesty is also interested in the Imperial Jade Seal? Noble consort Lu snorted. You didn't tell him about the Imperial Jade Seal. Do you think he won't suspect you when he comes back to his senses? Mo Jingqi didn't know anything else, but he was good at suspecting people. As long as there was a trace, no matter whether it was true or not, he would suspect him first. Tan Jiji said carelessly, I've been at his beck and call for 10 years. I'm tired. I'm preparing to change my identity. I'm afraid I won't have so much time to see Noble Consort Lu in the future. I really don't want to leave. Get out. Noble Consort Lu said coldly. Tan Jiji sighed. He walked to Noble Consort Lu's side and lifted a strand of her hair. He said softly, Royo, when we get the world in the future, I'll let you deal with Mo Xiaoyao and Yili personally. Get out. In Ryong City, Mo Xiaoyao leaned against the couch and looked at Prince Da and Mo Jingyu in front of him. Last night, Suja suddenly fell seriously ill and couldn't even get out of bed this morning. Naturally, he couldn't attend this meeting. As for Mo Jian, he seemed to have been forgotten and only sat on the side to accompany the guests. After a night, Prince Da's expression became much more restrained. Mo Xiaoyao nodded secretly. This was the Prince Da who had escaped unscathed from the fight for the throne. After all these years of living like a prince, she was afraid that he had forgotten the prudence of the royal family. Lowering his head to take a sip of tea, Mo Xiaoyao asked, King Da and King Yu, what decree does the emperor have for I? King Da and King Yu looked at each other. They could hear the ridicule in Mo Xiaoyao's words. King Yu cupped his hands and said, Prince Ding, please forgive me. Uncle and I are only here on orders to convey the emperor's intentions. Presumably, Prince already understood yesterday that His Majesty's intention is for His Majesty to immediately return to the capital. Of course, although His Majesty's order in his rage cannot be withdrawn, His Majesty will naturally return everything that belongs to Prince. King Yu didn't dare to say anything more. He only explained Mo Jingqi's intentions in full detail. He wasn't willing to say anything else. Mo Xiaoyao laughed loudly and said, I understand your Majesty's meaning, but I'm afraid it won't be as the Emperor wishes. King Yu's heart sank. Was Prince Ding determined to fall out with the Da Chu state? Mo Xiaoyao raised his hand to stop him from speaking and said, King Yu, please go back and inform the Emperor that the Mahist army will remember the Emperor's previous actions. Even if I am willing to take the risk to trust the Emperor, I'm afraid the Mahist army will not agree. King Yu swallowed his saliva with difficulty and said with difficulty, the Prince Ding mansion has been loyal to the country for generations. Why is the prince so decisive? Even if there is anything you are dissatisfied with, as long as the prince says it out loud, I will definitely report it to the Emperor and discuss it again. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and said, discuss again? I appreciate King Yu's good intentions. At the same time, King Yu can also tell the Emperor and the ministers that as long as I am here, the Western Tomb will not invade the Da Chu state from the northwest. King Yu felt bitter in his heart. As long as the Mahist army was in the northwest, the Western Tomb would naturally not have the chance to invade from the northwest. However, the Western Tomb and the Da Chu state shared a border in the southwest. Although the journey was several times more dangerous than the one in the northwest, as long as one had the will, the Da Chu state was still weak in the southwest border. It was not impossible for the Western Tomb to invade the Da Chu state from the southwest. King Da looked at Mo Xiaoyao and asked, Prince Ding, have you made up your mind? Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes and smiled indifferently. I just want to give the Mahist army and their wives and children a way out. The Prince Ding mansion has defended the Da Chu state for generations. Even if there is no merit, there is still hard work. I can't let the Prince Ding mansion end here for my, right? If that's the case, how can I face my royal father, elder brother, and the ancestors of the Prince Ding mansion in the future? King Do was silent for a long time, then nodded and said, "All right, I and King Yu can't persuade you. We have already passed on the Emperor's decree, so we won't say anything else. I only hope that Prince Ding will not forget that the men of the Ding mansion and the Mahist army are still citizens of the Dechu state." Mo Xiaoyao smiled without saying a word. After ordering people to send King Da and King Yu back to the guest courtyard to rest, Yili walked out from behind while holding onto the girl's hand. She smiled faintly and said, "After not seeing you for one night, King Da's changed quite a bit." And Mo Xiaoyao stood up to support her. He waved his hand to dismiss the girl and said, "To be able to return safely from the hands of the previous emperor for so many years, King Da is also an old fox who is cultivated to become a spirit. It's just that he's been a little too complacent these past few years. He thinks that just because Mo Jingqi calls him Imperial Uncle, he really respects him like an uncle." She didn't know that Mo Jingqi hated those old officials and elders who suppressed him the most. He didn't need to be instigated. As long as there was a chance, Mo Jingqi wanted to kill them. Now that he has taken out his righteous words to persuade even if I don't give him face, I still have to let them safely return to the Chu capital. Slowly sitting down, Yili recalled the performance of the two princes just now. If it was said that he was a lobbyist for Mo Jingqi, he would lack some persuasiveness. He only said what Mo Jingqi meant, and then gave Mo Xiaoyao a few sentences. It was obvious that neither of them wanted to really anger Mo Xiaoyao. Yili smiled faintly and said, "You originally planned to let them go back?" Mo Xiaoyao nodded slightly, sat down beside him, and said, "Although these two people can't do much, if they just want to find trouble for Mo Jingqi, it's enough. I don't want to pay attention to them for the next few months." Lowering his head to look at Yi Li's round belly, he raised his hand and gently stroked it. Coincidentally, the baby in her belly kicked. Mo Xiaoyao raised his brows. Seeing Yi Li frown slightly, he said, "This kid really doesn't know his place. He must be properly trained after he is born." Yi Li didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She didn't know if it was her imagination, but as long as Mo Xiaoyao was by her side, especially when she touched him, the child in her stomach would become especially lively. He said helplessly, "What can a fetus know? Prince is becoming more and more childish." Mo Xiaoyao raised his sword-like eyebrows. He made up his mind that when the child was born, he would definitely teach him a good lesson. A few days later, King Da and King Yu bid farewell to Mo Xiaoyao and prepared to return to the capital. However, Suzhou was seriously ill. When King Yu personally went to take a look, Suzhou was already skinny to the point of skin and bones and had fallen into a coma. That appearance could not be faked no matter what. Not to mention returning to the capital, even if he did not take good care of himself, he would still be able to die from a cold. However, the two kings knew that the Northwest was not a place they could stay for long. He could only bid farewell to Mo Xiaoyao and return to the capital to report to the emperor. When Suzhou was better, he would send someone to bring him back to the capital. Mo Xiaoyao naturally wouldn't keep them. The two of them and Mo Jian didn't pursue the matter of why there were less than half of the guards left with Mo Jian and Mo Jian. They set off on the same day. Mo Xiaoyao only smiled indifferently when he heard this. He sent Zhang Yu and Lu Jingxian, who was stationed in Riyang, to personally escort the two princes out of the city. Chapter 431. In the dim dungeon, Mo Xiaoyao sat on a chair and lazily looked at the middle-aged man who was tied to a wooden stake and covered in blood. He raised his eyebrows and smiled. Deputy Commander of the Imperial Guards? The Emperor's trusted aide and favorite general, Xue Qingliang? And the Empress Dowager's nephew, the Emperor's cousin? Mo Jingqi is really willing to spend a lot of money to send you to the Northwest? The man raised his head and looked at the man in white with white hair. His eyes flashed with a trace of panic. In a dark and dirty place like the dungeon, This kind of white color made people's heart feel even more cold. Mo Xiaoyao didn't care and smiled indifferently. I heard that Commander Xue is known as the #1 expert in the palace, and your martial arts are only slightly worse than Mu Qingsong's. After so many years, you've only been a deputy commander of the Imperial Guards. It's really a waste of talent. Xue Qingliang suddenly raised his head. He didn't have any fame in the capital and had been an unremarkable deputy commander of the Imperial Guards for so many years. He didn't expect Mo Xiaoyao to have investigated him so thoroughly. Mo Xiaoyao leaned back in his chair and looked at him from the corner of his eyes. After entering my Riyang city, Commander Xue shouldn't be thinking that you can safely leave, right? I won't let people torture you. I reckon that torture is useless to you. Do you plan to say it yourself, or do you want to think of a way to make you say it? Xue Chengliang sneered. Does Riyang City belong to the prince? Does this world belong to the king? Does the king think that Riyang is yours just because you've occupied it? I really didn't expect that the Ding imperial residence would produce a rebel. I don't know if Mo Lanyan and Mo Lufeng will be able to face the great ancestor and the late emperor in the underworld. Mo Xiaoyao didn't care about his cursing. His eyes were as cold as snow. I didn't expect Commander Xue to be such a loyal and patriotic person. I really admire him. However, I don't know if Commander Xue's confidant and the young master who was born not long ago are also loyal and patriotic people. Xue Chengliang was stunned, and a trace of panic appeared in his eyes. Only now did he truly believe that Mo Xiaoyao had investigated his identity thoroughly. If Mo Xiaoyao had used his family to threaten him, he might not have cared. However, he was the son of a concubine of the Xue family, and the head of the Xue family was the sister of the Empress Dowager. He had suffered a lot since he was young. He had no feelings for the Xue family, including his wife. But the confidant and newborn child mentioned by Mo Xiaoyao were indeed his favorite. She was his childhood sweetheart, the first woman he loved in this life. She had accompanied him through the most difficult times of those years, and now they had a son. Originally, he had already planned to ask the emperor for an imperial decree after returning home, so that he could openly welcome her and their child back home as his wives. Seeing Xue Chengliang's expression change, Mo Xiaoyao smiled in satisfaction and raised his hand to move his fingers. Behind him, Qin Feng took out a portrait and unfolded it before handing it to Xue Chengliang. Xue Chengliang's originally green face immediately paled. The people in the portrait were his sweetheart and his son. Not to mention their appearance, even the courtyard in the background was exactly the same. Xue Chengliang exclaimed in shock, "That's impossible. How could you?" Mo Xiaoyao's smile was cold and emotionless. I truly didn't know that Commander Xue would grace the Northwest with his presence. But I never said that I would never return to the Chu capital. Since that's the case, we naturally need to properly investigate what kind of people are at His Majesty's side. Ever since the incident with Tan Jiji, Mo Xiaoyao had ordered Tianyi Pavilion and the Shadow Guard to thoroughly investigate Mo Jingqi's side. Although they couldn't be certain that they had uncovered all of Mo Jingqi's hidden pawns, they had still gained some results. "What do you want?" Xue Chengliang asked in a hoarse voice. Mo Xiaoyao stood up and said, "Commander Xue has been at His Majesty's side since he was 15, so you must know a lot. Don't worry, you can slowly think about it. In less than a month, I guarantee that Commander Xue's family will be reunited. At that time, it won't be too late for Commander Xue to slowly consider what answer to give." After saying this, Mo Xiaoyao no longer paid any attention to Xue Chengliang, who was tied to a pillar and covered in blood. He turned and walked out of the prison cell. Behind him, Xue Chengliang roared angrily, "Mo Xiaoyao, you're not allowed to hurt them." "Oh right, Commander Xue, please don't think of committing suicide or anything stupid. I don't have a rule of not killing women and children, or do you want her son to suffer in your place? Mo Xiaoyao, you'll die a horrible death." Xue Chengliang looked at the man in front of him with white robes and hair as white as snow, as if he was looking at a demon or a ghost. "Die a horrible death?" Mo Xiaoyao snorted. "I have already died more than 10 times. I may not be afraid of death, but Commander Xue, are you afraid?" Xue Chengliang was speechless. Was he afraid of death? Of course he was. He had suffered countless hardships since he was young, and now that he finally had his own family and his own child, how could he not be afraid of death? Suja woke up 5 days after Do Wang and Yuang left. Hearing Emo Xiaoyao say that the second king had already left with his men, Suja was stunned for a moment. He looked at Emo Xiaoyao and shook his head. Why is your highness doing this? Emo Xiaoyao was silent for a moment before saying, Elder Su's body can no longer withstand the long journey. If Elder Su insists on returning, he will have to wait until his body fully recovers. If Elder Su does not wish to live in Ryong City, there is a courtyard outside the city for Elder Su to stay temporarily. Suja sighed, shook his head, and did not say anything more. He only lived alone in the quiet courtyard of the prince's mansion to recuperate. He read books and rarely left the house. He also did not ask about Su Zuidi's matters. When the child was 9 months old, a piece of news suddenly spread throughout the various countries. It was said that the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu's treasure and the imperial jade seal were in the northwest. The previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu was considered to be an even more legendary figure than the De Chu state's great ancestor. It was said that he had once obtained the Golden City's treasure, which was only recorded in unofficial history. It was said that it was a city built with gold. It could be imagined how rich the Emperor Gaozu's family was if this rumor was true. Not to mention the imperial jade seal that caused the nobles of the various countries to scramble for it. As soon as this news came out, there were immediately signs of various people moving about in the northwest, causing the originally calm situation in the northwest to immediately become tense. Yili's belly was getting bigger and bigger. After 9 months, the child could be born at any time. Emo Xiaoyao had already sent people to choose servants and midwives to stay in the mansion at any time. Not only that, but because Yili had always disliked other people serving her, Emo Xiaoyao specially sent people to bring over the people by Yi Li's side that were originally in the Chu capital. Seeing that Chief Steward Emo had been transferred to the northwest, leaving the Central Plains affairs unattended, Feng Xiao repeatedly cursed and sent a letter to Leng Haoyu to have him temporarily take over the Central Plains affairs. Qin Feng, who went to pick up the people, arrived in Ryong City at almost the same time as the news of the previous dynasty's treasure. Emo Xiaoyao, who had originally been accompanying Yi Li to relax, received the news from Zhuijing. His expression darkened, and he coldly said, Tan Jiji, you really are in a hurry to die. Yi Li took the letter and glanced at it. She nudged Emo Xiaoyao and said, hurry and go take care of it. Feng San and the others are definitely waiting. Emo Xiaoyao sighed softly and gently said, I'll be right back. You don't have to worry too much. Yi Li smiled and nodded. She watched as Emo Xiaoyao left. Only then did she turn around to look at the people at the side and said with a faint smile, Nanny Mother Lin, are you all well? Chapter 432. The two mamas were already in tears. If it wasn't for the fact that Emo Xiaoyao had been present, they would have already thrown themselves in front of Yi Li and cried. Miss Wang Fei, we old servants thought we would never see you again. Qing Shuang and the others also crowded around Yi Li, crying and laughing as they spoke. For a moment, the room was very lively. Yi Li smiled as she looked at them. In the blink of an eye, they had not seen each other for a year. Usually, she did not feel it, but now that she saw them, she realized how much she had missed them. Seeing Qing Shuang stare at her as she wiped her tears and refused to speak, Yi Li smiled and reached out to touch her pink cheeks. She smiled and said, a year, Qing Shuang has grown into a big girl. Qing Shuang's face turned red, and she glared fiercely at Yi Li. She said, Miss is so cruel. You didn't come to pick up Qing Shuang for so long. Qing Shuang will ignore Miss. Yi Li apologized and said softly, silly girl, what's so good about coming to the northwest with me? Isn't it good to stay in Jing? Even though Emo Jingqi had given the order to strip Emo Xiaoyao of his title, he still did not dare to openly seize the Prince Ding mansion. But for safety, Chief Steward Emo still moved the important things in mansion. Of course, This included the important people in the mansion. These girls had the protection of the shadow guard of the Prince Ding mansion in Jing. It was better than coming all the way to the northwest. If Emo Shuyao had not sent Qin Feng to pick them up, Yili had not planned to bring them to Riyang. Mother Lin, Nanny, it's been hard on you. Looking at the slightly thin Nanny and Mother Lin, Yili felt even more guilty. Originally, the Nanny and Mother Lin had been brought to second uncle's Fu. When the situation stabilized, they would be sent back to Yunzhou. But now, she was brought to Riyang from afar. Not only was she separated from her family, but the climate in the northwest was also not as good as the capital and Yunzhou. Wei Mama wiped her tears and joyfully examined Yili's abdomen. She smiled and said, "Wang Fei, what are you saying? To be able to serve Wang Fei and little Shitzi is the best. Where did the hardship come from? This year, Wang Fei, so many things have happened in Jing that we have not been able to eat or sleep well after hearing about them. It's a pity that we are so far away that we don't know anything." Lin Mama nodded her head and said, "That's right. Now that I can see Wang Fei give birth to Ping and the little Shitzi, this old servant will be able to answer to young miss in the future." The young miss that Lin Mama was referring to as naturally Yili's mother, Su Shi. Yili held Mother Lin's hand and said softly, "Since that's the case, I'll have to trouble Mother and wet nurse in the future. You must be tired from the long journey. Why don't you rest for a few days before we talk about other things?" Although Mother Lin and the wet nurse were reluctant to part, they were indeed not young anymore. The bumpy journey was indeed not light. They could only let the servants take them to rest. The young Yahuan also had tired expressions, but their spirits were unusually good. They surrounded Yi Li and chattered endlessly with curiosity and joy. With great difficulty, Yi Li finally managed to calm them down and let the servants take them to rest. Seeing the hall quiet down again, Yi Li smiled and said to Qin Feng, who was standing at the side, "It hasn't been so lively in a long time. I'm not used to it." Qin Feng smiled faintly and said, "Wang Fei doesn't like people to serve her, and the people by her side don't dare to disturb Wang Fei. But these girls have been with Wang Fei for a long time and are very close to Wang Fei." Yili nodded and changed her mind to ask about proper matters. On the way back, "Did you hear any news?" Qin Feng nodded and said, "When we were close to the northwest, we did hear some rumors. But we didn't take the official roads on the way back, so there wasn't any important news. It's just that the news of the previous dynasty's treasure may have first spread from the capital, but it didn't come from the capital." Yili nodded. Qin Feng and the others hadn't been slow on the way back. When he left the capital, he hadn't heard the news, but when he arrived in the northwest, it had already spread to the entire world. This news naturally didn't come from the capital. There were probably people secretly spreading it everywhere. Snorting softly, Yili sneered and said, "The prince is right. Tan Jiji is indeed in a hurry to die." The baby in Yili's stomach seemed to have sensed its mother's anger. Yili only felt 2 kicks in her stomach. She frowned and smiled helplessly as she reached out to comfort the baby. This child was very lively even in the womb. It would definitely be a mischievous little brat in the future. Qin Feng looked awkwardly at Yili. He wanted to say something but stopped. Yili smiled at him and said, "If you have something to say, just say it. Is Commander Qin shy?" Qin Feng's handsome face reddened slightly. Yili smiled in surprise and said, "Could it be that I guessed correctly? Has Commander Qin encountered some luck with women this time?" Qin Feng smiled helplessly and said, "Princess, don't tease this subordinate. It's just that this subordinate saved someone on the road and brought her back to Riyang without princess permission. Princess, please punish me." "Saved someone? Could it be an old acquaintance?" Yili asked, with a raised brow. Qin Feng nodded and said, "It's Miss Yaoji. Does Princess still remember?" Of course Yi Li remembered. Holding her stomach and sitting steadily, Yili asked, "What happened? Tell me from the beginning." Only then did Qin Feng tell her everything from the beginning. It turned out that after Qin Feng picked up Director Mo's group, he took them to avoid the official roads and traveled day and night. However, They encountered Yaoji, who was being chased outside a small town more than 300 li away from the capital.
It was not exactly a chase.
At that time, Yaoji was fiercely protecting a child. The other party probably wanted to snatch the child. However, Yaoji resisted desperately and finally angered the other party, so they wanted to kill her and snatch the child. Qin Feng had seen Yaoji a few times. Naturally, he could not leave her in the lurch. Therefore, he defeated the group of people and rescued Yaoji. However, Yaoji's appearance was too outstanding. Now that there were wars everywhere, they had nowhere to go with the child. Therefore, Qin Feng brought her back. Yili smiled and said, "What did I do at that time? Did you send someone to investigate Yaoji?" Qin Feng nodded and said, "That day, I ordered the shadow guard to investigate. There was nothing suspicious." Yili nodded and said, "You have always been reliable. Yaoji is also an old acquaintance, so you brought her back. But have you thought about how to settle her down?" Qin Feng was a little distressed. He only cared about rescuing her. When did he think about how to settle her down? Yili covered her mouth and smiled. Yaoji must have fled in panic when being chased. Otherwise, with her ability, she would not be so embarrassed. If she had some money and property, it would be fine to find a place for her to live and make a living in the city. But look at her. When I rescued her, I saw that her clothes were old and she was thin. I am afraid she did not have much money. Qin Feng suddenly understood. He nodded and said, "Thank you for your advice, Wang Fei. I understand. I will find a place for her to settle down later. I also have some savings. There is no harm in giving her some for temporary use." Yili wished she could knock Qin Feng's wooden head. She rolled her eyes at him and said, "She is a single woman with a child. How can she accept your money? Although she used to be a prostitute, now that she is a child, how can she not consider the child? It is not easy to stay here. Naturally, she will not go back to her old job. Does she still want her reputation?" Unless Qin Feng planned to marry her, it was better not to be too solicitous. Qin Feng was a little dispirited. He looked at Yi Li helplessly. He could not give her money, but he also could not refuse. How could saving someone be more troublesome than going to the battlefield? Chapter 433. Yili sighed and said, "Ask Miss Yaoji to come. Maybe she already has a plan." Yaoji was not one of those girls who had no opinions. Even though they had only met a few times and Yili did not agree with some of her actions, it did not prevent her from appreciating Yaoji's uniqueness. Qin Feng sighed in relief. It was good that Wang Fei was willing to intervene. He really did not know how to deal with Yaoji. "Thank you, Wang Fei." A short while later, Yaoji was brought in by the guards outside. Seeing the thin and pale woman in front of her, Yili could not help but sigh inside. The Yaoji in front of her was like a different person compared to the sad and stubborn woman from a year ago who was still radiant. The originally delicate face and snow-white skin appeared thin and sallow due to the adverse effects for a long time. One could only vaguely see the former beauty from the beautiful outline. Her beautiful hair was only casually tied with a cloth, and the yellow and dry hair hung down behind her back. Yaoji was holding a swaddling cloth in her hands. The child looked well taken care of. It was about 5 or 6 months old. She waved her hand to indicate Qin Feng to leave first. Qin Feng looked hesitantly at Yaoji and frowned slightly. Even though the matter of Yaoji had been investigated, Wang Fei was now at a very critical time. There could not be any mistakes. Thinking of this, Qin Feng regretted disturbing Wang Fei with this matter at this time. He only thought that he had to report to Wang Fei that he had rescued Yaoji without permission and brought her back. But he forgot that Wang Fei was about to give birth. As long as nothing happened to Yaoji, it was okay to report later. Seeing Qin Feng hesitate, Yili smiled faintly and said, "You go out first. I want to talk to Miss Yaoji." Qin Feng could only retreat outside the door and wait. Yili smiled apologetically at Yaoji and said, "Sorry for the embarrassment." Yaoji shook her head and smiled faintly. Qin Darren is so loyal to Wang Fei. It really makes one envious. Yili looked at the child in Yaoji's arms. From time to time, Yaoji lowered her head to look at him and rocked gently. Her sickly face was full of love. This child. Yaoji held the child tightly in her arms and said softly, "This is my child. He's almost half a year old. His name is Shenjingen. Do you think my name is good?" Yili nodded and said, "Will the child follow your surname?" Yili seemed to remember that Yaoji once mentioned that her original surname was Shen, and her name was Shen Yao. Yaoji seemed to think of something and nodded silently. Looking at the originally peerless beauty in front of her now in such a sorry state, Yili's heart was filled with regret. "I remember that you had a lot of money when you left the capital. How did you end up in such a state?" Qingqing Lane was secretly sold to Yili. The money obtained was definitely enough for Yaoji and the child to live a life of luxury. Yaoji smiled bitterly and gently stroked the sleeping child, saying, "Yaoji is conceited and doesn't lose to anyone." But after leaving Qingqing Lane, I realized that other than singing and dancing, I don't know anything else. Although I hate the identity of a courtesan, this identity has allowed me to live freely these years. Otherwise, I'm afraid that I would have been bought back to be a concubine. Originally, I thought that although Muyang and I couldn't have a happy ending, at least we could part on good terms. Who knew? Originally, after Yaoji left the capital, because she was already 3 months pregnant, she could only find a remote place near the capital to stay and wait for the child to be born before she set off for the future to start anew. Unexpectedly, several villages near the town where she temporarily lived belonged to Marquis Muyang's family. Among them, a steward recognized Yaoji's identity and reported it to Marquis Muyang. At that time, Yaoji's belly was already 6 months pregnant. Muyang was following Yili to fight in the northwest and hadn't returned. Although Marquis Muyang looked down on Yaoji's identity, at that time, the war in the northwest was a crisis. Marquis Muyang was afraid that something might happen to her son, so she didn't want to abort Yaoji's child. She just asked her family to keep an eye on Yaoji. With Yaoji's intelligence, how could she not guess that no matter whether Muyang could come back or not, the day the child was born would be the day she died? So she had to bribe the guards with her money and wait for an opportunity to escape, but she was caught and brought back. Marquis Muyang's family took all of Yaoji's money and didn't leave her even half a copper coin. When they came back, Yaoji was about to give birth. Fortunately, the woman in charge of taking care of Yaoji was soft-hearted and secretly reported to Muyang. When Muyang arrived, it was the day Yaoji gave birth. If Muyang didn't come quickly and break into the delivery room, Yaoji would have died of a hemorrhage that day. After that, because of Muyang's insistence, Yaoji and the child were settled in a courtyard in Marquis Muyang's mansion. Then Muyang married Miss Sunday. Yaoji rested for a few days. When Muyang came to see her and the child, she asked Marquis Muyang's mansion to return her money, and then she would leave with the child. But Muyang didn't agree no matter what, and Marquis Muyang's family didn't admit that they took Yaoji's money at all. Yaoji was so angry that she almost fainted. She had saved up for so many years, and Yili didn't treat her badly when she sold Qingqing Lane. Not counting the jewelry and treasures, only the banknotes were worth more than 200,000 taels. In order to prevent Yaoji from taking the money and trying to escape, Muyang acquiesced to his maternal family's statement. In this way, Yaoji couldn't even take out half a copper coin, let alone bribing the guards of the courtyard to escape. But Yaoji was stubborn. Every time Muyang went to see her, they always quarreled endlessly. And the behavior of Muyang's frequent visit to the courtyard naturally aroused the suspicion of the new Marquis Muyang. So when Muyang was ordered to go on official business by Marquis Muyang, who was already very dissatisfied with this, Yaoji and the child were almost starved to death in the courtyard. When Muyang came back, he naturally made a big fuss again. Then he took Yaoji and the child to a small courtyard under his name. Yaoji spent more than a month to soften her body and lower Muyang's guard. Then she took advantage of Muyang's drunkenness to escape with the child and a few worthless things, and went all the way west. As for the people who chased after her and wanted to steal the child, She didn't know whether they were sent by Muyang or Marquis Muyang's mansion. Looking at Yili, who was still radiant with a big belly in front of her, Yaoji smiled bitterly. If Princess Ding encountered such a thing, she certainly wouldn't be as embarrassed as she was. During the days when she was locked in the courtyard and almost starved to death, Yaoji finally understood that it was simply a daydream to control her own destiny by herself. The reason why she was in the limelight for so many years was just that she had the title of the #1 dancer, and Muyang and Feng Sen secretly protected her. Without these, she was just a useless woman who couldn't move an inch in this world. After listening to Yaoji's story, Yili didn't know whether to sigh or be angry. After pondering for a moment, Yili asked, "What do you plan to do in the future? According to what you said, your money was taken away by Marquis Muyang's mansion. I can ask someone to get it back for you. What do you plan to do in the future?" Yaoji looked down at the child in her arms and raised her head. "Yaoji begs your highness to find a good family to adopt my child. I don't ask for glory and wealth, as long as my parents live in harmony." Chapter 434. Yili frowned and asked in confusion, "What are you doing? If you don't want his child, why did you bring him out? If he stays in Marquis Muyang's mansion, Muyang won't mistreat the child because of your relationship." Yaoji smiled bitterly and looked at Yili. "I've heard about Princess's family. Princess, as the legitimate daughter of a noble family, is mistreated by her stepmother. Not to mention my son. Miss Sun wants to kill my son. How much can Muyang care about him? Besides, having a mother who used to be a dancer is not a matter of honor. Yaoji just wants him to be safe and sound for the rest of his life." Yili was a little embarrassed. She lowered her head and thought, "It's not convenient for me to do things now. Why don't you live in Ryong City now and think about your future plans? If you insist, I'll find a good family for the child." Yaoji was overjoyed and said with tears in her eyes, "Shenyao thanks Princess." Although she said it resolutely, she was very reluctant to leave the child she carried for 10 months. Yili gave her more time to think. Although she had made up her mind, it was always good to be with the child for a while. She ordered Qin Feng to take Yaoji out. When Yili was thinking about Yaoji with her head down, Emo Xiaoyao strolled in. Seeing Yili frowning, Emo Xiaoyao quickly sat beside her and checked, "Why are you unhappy? Are you not feeling well?" Yili shook her head. She leaned in Emo Xiaoyao's arms and told him about Yaoji's matter. In the end, she sighed and said, "Muyang has really gone too far this time. Not only to Yaoji, but also to the newly married granddaughter." Even if the people who chased Yaoji were sent by Miss Sun, Yili wouldn't be too surprised. Hearing Yili worry so much about other people's business, Emo Xiaoyao was displeased. Letting her lean against his chest, he gently stroked her round belly and said, "Let other people take care of these trivial matters. If Li has the time to worry about these trivial matters, it's better to think about other things." Yili looked up at him with a smile and said, "What are you thinking about? Have you thought of a name for the baby?" Emo Xiaoyao frowned. "Is it so troublesome to come up with a name?" Yili's lips twitched. She looked at the jealous man and smiled. "Baby Emo? Are you sure the baby won't blame us for naming him like that?" As long as she thought of a handsome young man or middle-aged man who looked like Emo Xiaoyao staring at baby Emo, she couldn't help but laugh. Emo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and said, "Does he dare?" Yili nodded seriously and said, "Believe me, he really dares. As long as it was a man with such a name, he wouldn't be able to resist offending his superiors." Emo Xiaoyao snorted and said, "Then let's call him Emo Xiaobao." Yili rolled her eyes. She decided not to talk about this issue with him for the time being. If this man got angry and insisted on calling the baby Emo Baobao or Emo Xiaobao, she wouldn't be able to compete with him. In any case, there was still time to name the baby before he turned 1-year-old. Otherwise, she could ask grandfather and uncle to name him. She calmly changed the topic and asked, "How is the matter of the previous dynasty's treasure? Why did it come back so soon?" Emo Xiaoyao casually said, "Wasn't it all Tan Jiji's doing? Did he think he could escape after causing trouble for I?" Yili asked curiously, What did you do? Mo Xiuyao lightly said, Of course I told his true identity to our emperor. It was also a show of loyalty to the Dechu state. Yili raised her eyebrows and said, When Tanjiji left the northwest, he should have been prepared for his identity to be exposed, right? Mo Xiuyao coldly smiled and said, What if he added the imperial jade seal? Would anyone believe that the imperial jade seal is on him? Yili asked. There will be people who will believe it. When we return, send the shadow guard to kill Tanjiji. There's no need to kill him. Just make him hand over the imperial jade seal. Mo Xiuyao indifferently said. Yili understood and smiled. Even the Ding Palace was chasing after Tanjiji for the imperial jade seal. Then those who were interested in the imperial jade seal would naturally have to think twice. As for who to believe, that was a matter of opinion. Mo Xiuyao hugged Yili and lazily rubbed against her shoulder, saying, Yili doesn't need to care about these trivial matters now. As long as baby Li is safely born, everything will be fine. Quickly get rid of this annoying brat. Then Yi Li would be his alone. Don't call him baby Mo. It doesn't sound nice. Yi Li seriously argued for her son's rights. Mo Xiuyao indifferently changed his words, Mo Xiaobao. Yi Li face-bombed and looked at the man's stubborn handsome face. She sighed. Pet name? Mo Xiuyao lightly snorted and didn't say anything. When the pet name was more famous than the official name, was there any difference between the official name and pet name? As a result, the handsome and famous future young master of the Prince Ding mansion had a pet name that he would never be able to get rid of in his entire life. When Qin Feng returned to the Chu capital this time, he didn't only bring back Yili's servants and chief steward Mo. He also brought back the Imperial Guard's deputy commander's beloved concubine and son. Xue Chunliang, who had been stubbornly refusing to say anything, couldn't hold back anymore when he saw the delicate and beautiful beloved concubine and the smart and adorable son, who was 2 years old. He didn't even need to be punished. He directly confessed. In the dungeon, Mo Xiuyao was still calmly and leisurely sitting on the large soft couch, coldly watching the family reunion in front of him. Feng Ziyao and Qin Feng stood behind him and watched. After comforting his crying wife and son, Xue Chunliang stood up and said, Prince, I can tell you whatever you want to know. But please, Prince, do not harm my wife and son no matter what. Mo Xiuyao furrowed his brows and nodded, saying, All right. I promise that as long as you tell me what I want to know, I will definitely not harm this mother and son. My body can give them a safe place to live. Xue Chunliang chuckled and said, This one naturally trusts Prince Ding's personal promise.
Prince, you can ask.
Mo Xiuyao waved his hand and had people take the mother and son away. The dungeon was quiet for a while before he asked, Why did Mo Jingqi spend so much effort to save Su Zuodi? Hearing this, not only was Xue Chunliang stunned, even Feng Ziyao and Qin Feng couldn't help but be startled. Feng Ziyao looked at Mo Xiuyao and silently said in his heart, Prince, don't tell me you still have feelings for that woman, Su Zuodi. It was probably because Feng Ziyao's expression was too explicit that Mo Xiuyao coldly glanced at him. Feng Ziyao instantly felt a chill run down his spine. He lightly coughed and adjusted his expression, looking at Xue Chunliang with a serious expression. Xue Chunliang was very surprised by this question. His expression changed as he looked at Mo Xiuyao's cold and calm expression. After a moment of silence, he said, The Emperor and Su Zuodi have known each other since they were young. When the Emperor just ascended the throne, he mentioned to Su Darren that he wanted to take Su Xiaojia into the palace as a concubine, but was rejected by Su Darren. Mo Xiuyao raised his eyes and said indifferently, You want to tell I that the Emperor still has feelings for Su Zuodi, and that's why he sent so many people to save her? Xue Chunliang was silent. He also understood how absurd this answer was. He had followed Mo Jingqi before he ascended the throne, so he naturally knew what kind of person he was. Even if Su Zuodi was 100 times more beautiful, Mo Jingqi wouldn't pay such a great price just for a beautiful woman. Thinking, Xue Chunliang asked, What does Prince want to know? Chapter 435. Mo Xiaoyao looked down at his slender fingers and said, for example, the relationship between Su Zuidi and Tan Jiji. Xue Chengliang frowned. Tan Jiji suddenly appeared by the emperor's side 10 years ago. The emperor values his intelligence and sees him as a think tank. As for his relationship with Miss Su, I don't know, but they know each other. Tan Jiji's real identity is the orphan of the previous dynasty's imperial family. Or, you can tell why Mo Jingqi trusts him so much. This, Commander Xue doesn't know, right? Hearing this, Xue Chengliang's face changed. He stared at Mo Xiaoyao in shock without realizing it. Mo Xiaoyao gave a cold snort, his sword-like eyebrows slightly raised as he said coldly, Feng-san, bring that child in for this prince. Xue Chengliang was startled as he hurriedly said, no.
Prince, please let that child go.
I'll tell you everything you want to know. Mo Xiaoyao nodded with satisfaction. Very good. Su Zuidi is in Ai's hands. But in these 2 months, countless people have come. Tan Jiji wants to kill. The emperor wants to save. I don't know when a woman became so important. Maybe you can give Ai an answer? Xue Chengliang's face was as white as paper. He looked at the tightly shut prison door. His wife and son were outside. If he said anything wrong, they would be consigned to eternal damnation. Weakly closing his eyes, Xue Chengliang finally opened his mouth and said, I don't know much. I only remember that I took something from Miss Su under the emperor's orders and handed it to Tan Jiji. Mo Xiaoyao narrowed his eyes. What is it? Xue Chengliang said, I don't know. It's just the thing was taken from the Prince Ding mansion. After that, Tan Jiji went to the northern tribes alone. A month later, the previous Prince Ding and the Mahist army were defeated at the border of the northern tribes. So, I guess there is a connection. After saying this, Xue Chengliang fell to the ground as if he had lost all his strength. Although he wasn't a good person, he wasn't really a heartless and inhumane person. After the incident at the Prince Ding mansion, he had a vague feeling that these things would come back one day, but he did not expect that he would have to wait for 10 years. The prison cell was completely silent. Only the crackling of the burning firewood could be heard from time to time. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes as he sat on the soft couch. A few strands of silver hair hung by his ears, making it impossible for others to see his expression. However, Feng Jiao and Qin Feng, who were standing behind him, could clearly see a few strands of silver threads moving even though there was no wind. The powerful and oppressive pressure made the two of them unconsciously take a few steps back. Both of them turned their heads at the same time and saw a look of disbelief on each other's faces. After a long time, when the 3 people in the cell were almost out of breath, Mo Xiaoyao said coldly, continue. Xue Chengliang's face was deathly pale. A trace of blood leaked out from the corner of his mouth. He did not think that Prince Ding's cultivation had already reached such a level. Just by using his inner strength, he was able to make him cough up blood. He shook his head and said, at the time, I was only the emperor's personal guard, so I didn't know much. The reason why the emperor wanted to save Miss Su was because Miss Su seemed to have taken 2 things from the Prince Ding mansion. However, she only gave one to the emperor. The other is still in Miss Su's hands. As for the other things, I don't know. Prince, Feng Jiao carefully called out. The silent Mo Xiaoyao was far more terrifying than when he was angry. Even though he knew logically that Mo Xiaoyao would not do anything to them, but Feng Jiao sighed. He quietly clenched his slightly trembling fingers in his sleeves. Qin Feng, take Su Zuidi. I don't care what method you use. I don't care how you do it. Make her spit out the answer today. Qin Feng's heart trembled. He nodded and said, this subordinate obeys. Feng Jiao frowned with some worry. Prince, Su Zuidi's mouth is not ordinarily hard. What if? Then let her die. Mo Xiaoyao said angrily, if you can't get the answer, send out all the Qilin. Capture all of Mo Jingqi's trusted aides. I don't believe that no one else knows about this. This subordinate obeys. Qin Feng nodded. He turned around and ran out of the prison without looking back. Prince. Feng Jiao only felt a bitter taste in his throat. He did not know what to say. The news that Xue Chunliang spat out was really too shocking. Just as he was in a difficult situation, there was a series of footsteps outside the door. Then he heard Director Mo's joyful voice. Prince. Reporting to Prince, Wang Fei is about to give birth. Mo Xiuyao was stunned. He suddenly stood up. Feng Jiao only saw a white shadow flash in front of him. Mo Xiuyao's figure was already gone from the prison cell. Bang! The soft bed that was originally fine instantly exploded into pieces, turning into a pile of debris. Looking at the pile of debris in front of him and Xue Chunliang, who was covered in wounds from the splashing wood shavings, Feng Jiao said indifferently, Commander Xue can be at ease here. Wang Fei is about to give birth to a son. If Prince is in a good mood, he may have a chance to live. Xue Chunliang smiled bitterly. He looked at Feng Jiao and said, Thank you for your comfort, young Master Feng-san. That year I had been panting for several years. I always felt that this day would come. I have no way to live. My wife and children are innocent. I only ask that Prince can let them live. Feng Jiao was silent. What Xue Chunliang had said was too shocking. If the prince didn't personally deal with it, no one would know what the final result would be. Glancing at Xue Chunliang, Feng Jiao turned and stepped out of the prison cell. The courtyard of the main courtyard was filled with people. The door to Yi Li's room was tightly shut, and there were only maids carrying water in and out of the room. However, before the crowd could take a look, the door was shut again. The people guarding outside the door saw a white shadow quickly fly over. In the blink of an eye, he was at the door. Mo Xiuyao raised a hand to push open the door and enter. On the side, Su Qingze and Su Qingfeng each grabbed his hand. Mo Xiuyao turned his head in displeasure. Even though Su Qingfeng had been trained under Qingfeng these 2 months, he couldn't help but release his hand. He smiled and said, Li is giving birth. Prince cannot enter. Mo Xiuyao frowned and said, I will go in to see Li. Xinyang said in a cold voice, What is there to see about a woman giving birth? You cannot enter the delivery room. Prince doesn't know. An icy gaze shot like an arrow to Xinyang. Xinyang persisted for a moment before giving in. As a medical practitioner, he could clearly detect that the presence on Prince's body was not right. He paused before saying, It is not auspicious for a man to enter the delivery room. Mo Xiuyao said coldly, I am not afraid. Xinyang was silent for a moment before finally saying, Wang Fei will give birth in about 2 to 4 hours. Prince can go in to see. Mo Xiuyao gave a light snort before turning to push open the door and walk in. Outside the door, Su Qingyan said in dissatisfaction, Mr. Shen, why can Prince go in but you won't let us? Xinyang silently wiped his sweat and said, Because if I refuse, Prince will immediately kill me. Compared to rules, his life was more important. When Mo Xiuyao entered, Mother Lin, who was guarding the door, stilled. She hurriedly said, Why did Prince come in? Without waiting for her to finish, Mo Xiuyao said, I will go see Li and will leave in a moment. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.